Shut it off! General Marcus Holt said those three words while Sergeant Reeves was still mid-sentence, still bleeding through the radio, still begging, still alive. An aide froze. Sir, they're still transmitting. I said, shut it off. The radio went silent. 9 men, breathing, fighting, screaming into the darkness for anyone to answer. Holt straightened his collar, picked up his coffee, and said to the room full of horrified faces, log it as signal lost. This conversation is over. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke, because every person in that room had just watched a general murder 9 men without firing a single shot. That was the moment Emily Carter's real war began. Before we go any further, if stories about courage, sacrifice, and the people who refuse to give up on each other move you the way they move me, please subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The radio crackled at 11:47 in the evening, and the sound of it made every person inside the forward operating base Carson communication room go completely still. It wasn't the static that stopped them. It was the voice underneath it. Sergeant Daniel Reeves had a voice made for calm. Even on his worst days in the field, even when everything around him was chaos and fire, and the kind of noise that made a man question whether he was still alive, Daniel's voice stayed level, measured, controlled. His men had called it his superpower. They said that if the world was ending, Daniel Reeves would sound like he was reading a weather report. But tonight that voice was broken. Not broken the way a radio signal breaks. Broken the way a man breaks when he has done everything right, followed every protocol, executed every contingency plan, and still found himself at the end of a road with nowhere left to go. Ravenswood, this is Sergeant Reeves. We are 2 men down critical. Grid position. Bravo November 7. Ammunition critical. Cannot hold position. Requesting immediate extraction. Black Hollow coordinates confirmed. This may be our last transmission. A pause. Then quiet or barely audible through the interference. If anyone is listening, please don't let us die here. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Walsh was the first to move. She crossed the room in 4 steps, grabbed the headset from the communications officer, and pressed it hard against her ear as if getting closer to the receiver would somehow pull those men out of the canyon by force of will alone. Raven Squad, this is FOB Carson. We copy your transmission. Confirm your status over. Static, she tried again. Nothing but the hiss and crackle of dead air where 9 human beings used to be. Walsh set the headset down with the careful deliberateness of a person who understood that if she moved too quickly, she might fall apart entirely. She turned to face the room. Every eye was on her. Every person in that space, communications officers, intelligence analysts, junior aides who had been awake for 32 hours, was looking at her the way people look at someone when they need to be told that things are going to be okay. She couldn't tell them that, because she had just heard 9 men announce that they were probably going to die, and she knew with the cold clarity of someone who had studied every mission that had ever entered Black Hollow Canyon that they were almost certainly right. Walsh moved through the corridor at a pace that she refused to call running, but was close enough that the 2 aides trailing behind her had to take quick steps to keep up. She pushed through the door of the command briefing room and found exactly who she expected to find. General Marcus Holt, 61 years old, 28 years of decorated service, sitting at the head of a table covered in maps and intelligence reports and satellite imagery that he had been studying for the past 4 hours. He looked up. Walsh didn't waste a syllable. Raven Squad is down. Black Hollow. 2 critical casualties. They cannot hold position. We need to scramble extraction aircraft immediately. Holt didn't move for a moment. His expression didn't change. He had the face of a man who had been given terrible information before, who had processed terrible information before, who had made terrible decisions before and lived with them, and that experience had carved something out of his face that might once have been warmth or hesitation, or the normal human instinct to flinch when something awful was confirmed. He picked up the satellite image of Black Hollow and studied it for a moment that felt to Patricia Walsh like somewhere between 3 seconds and 3 years. Then he put it back down. The last 4 aircraft we sent into Black Hollow didn't come back, Walsh. I know that, sir. Enemy positioning has not changed. If anything, our intelligence suggests they've reinforced. I know that too, sir. And you're asking me to send pilots and aircraft and crew members into that canyon. But Walsh leaned forward, both hands flat on the table. I'm asking you to send them in to bring our people home, General. Holt stood up slowly. He was a tall man, and when he stood in a room, he had a way of filling it that had nothing to do with physical size. He walked to the window, not to look at anything in particular, Walsh understood, but because he needed to be moving while he thought. She watched him. She watched him weigh lives against lives. She watched him do the calculation that commanders have always done and that never gets easier no matter how many times you do it. And then she heard him say the four words, "Leave them, they're gone." The silence in the room that followed those words was so total and so heavy that Walsh felt it like a physical thing pressing against her chest. "Sir, that's an order, Lieutenant Commander." Holt didn't turn around. He kept looking at the window, at nothing. "We will not send more aircraft into that canyon. We will not risk more lives." Raven Squad understood the parameters of this mission when they accepted it. The enemy has made Black Hollow impenetrable, and I am not going to fill it with the American bodies trying to prove otherwise. They're still alive, General. For now. For now means there's still time. Walsh, he turned. And the thing that Walsh saw in his face when he turned, it wasn't cruelty. She had expected cruelty, and cruelty would have been easier to argue with. What she saw was something worse. It was certainty. The absolute, convinced, unshakable certainty of a man who had decided that the math didn't work out. I understand what you're feeling. I understand the instinct. But my responsibility is to the totality of this mission and to the lives of every other soldier and pilot under my command. I will not authorize extraction into Black Hollow tonight. He sat back down. He picked up another report. The meeting, as far as he was concerned, was over. Walsh stood at that table for 2 more seconds. She counted them. 1, 2, and in those 2 seconds, she made a decision of her own, not about what she would accept, but about what she was going to do next. She walked out of the room without another word. The 2 aides who had followed her in scrambled after her, nearly colliding with each other in the doorway, and one of them, a young corporal named Martinez, who had been awake for so long that his eyes had developed a slight tremble, caught up with her in the corridor and said, "Commander Walsh, what are we going to do?" Walsh kept walking. "We're going to find Captain Carter," she said. Martinez nearly stumbled over his own feet. "Emily Carter." "Ma'am, she's been off active flight status for 2 years. Her clearance was, I know what her clearance was. She's working in the maintenance hangar, aircraft repair. She hasn't flown a combat mission since Black Hollow," Walsh said. "I know, which is exactly why she's the only person alive who can fly into it tonight and come back out." Martinez was quiet for a moment. "Then do you think she'll do it?" Walsh didn't slow down. "I think, as she said, that when Emily Carter hears that 9 men are dying in that canyon, the question of whether she'll do it will answer itself." She was right. But the truth of it, the full, complicated, painful truth of it, was more complicated than anyone standing in that corridor understood in that moment. Because Emily Carter had not simply walked away from flying. Emily Carter had been destroyed by it. The maintenance hangar sat at the far eastern edge of Phoebe Carson, separated from the main flight operations area by 300 meters of open tarmac, in a culture that had, over the past 2 years, developed a kind of unspoken agreement to pretend that the hangar didn't exist. It was where aircraft went when they were too damaged to fly and not quite damaged enough to be written off entirely. It was where things that used to matter went to wait out their remaining usefulness. Emily Carter had started to think of it as a mirror. She was 41 years old, and she looked every bit of it on the nights when the sleep wouldn't come, which was most nights. She had the hands of a mechanic, now stained with hydraulic fluid and engine grease, cracked at the knuckles from cold metal and long hours. She had the posture of someone who had learned that the safest way to exist in a space was to take up as little of it as possible. But her eyes still had the look. The people who had known her when she flew the crew chiefs and the fellow pilots and the ground personnel, who had watched her do things in an aircraft that other pilots described in the same hushed tones they reserved for things they didn't entirely believe they would look at her sometimes in the hangar and see it. That quality in her eyes that had nothing to do with rank or clearance or the official record of what she was or wasn't authorized to do. It was the look of someone who understood airspace the way some people understand music. Not intellectually, intuitively, down in the bones. She was lying on her back underneath a damaged cargo helicopter when Martinez found her hands deep inside a hydraulic assembly that had been giving the aircraft trouble for 3 days. She heard his footsteps on the hangar floor. She always heard footsteps, always cataloged them. One of the habits that 2 years of quiet work had not managed to break, and she knew from the rhythm that whoever was coming fast and was trying not to look like it. Captain Carter. She didn't come out from under the aircraft. I'm on modified duty corporal. Whatever it is, find someone with current flight clearance. It's not about clearance, ma'am. Then what is it about? A pause. She heard him take a breath. Black Hollow, he said. She came out from under the aircraft. She sat up on the rolling board she'd been lying on, and she looked at Martinez, and she said nothing for a moment while she processed the 2 words he had just said and all of the geography and history and memory that those 2 words contained. Who, she said. Raven Squad, ma'am. 9 men, 2 critical. They've been transmitting for the past hour, and the last call came in about 15 minutes ago. The General. Martinez stopped. Started again. The General has decided not to authorize extraction. Emily stood up. She was not a tall woman, but standing had always done something particular to her posture, the way pilots stand when they're near aircraft with a kind of alert readiness that the body maintains, even when the conscious mind has given up on it. He's abandoning them, she said. It was not a question. He made a determination that the tactical situation. He's abandoning them. She pulled a rag from her pocket and wiped her hands. It was a habitual motion, automatic, and she kept her eyes on Martinez while she did it. How long do they have? The medic's assessment based on the last transmission, the 2 critical casualties, maybe 2 hours, maybe less. And nobody's going in. No authorized aircraft, number, Commander Walsh. He stopped again. Emily looked at him steadily. Commander Walsh sent you here. Yes, ma'am. Because she wants me to fly. He met her eyes. Yes, ma'am. The hangar was very quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved across the tarmac with the particular sound it made in this region, a low, sustained pressure, like the bass note of a chord that never resolved. Emily walked past Martinez without another word. He turned to follow her. Ma'am, where are you going? Shadow One, she said. He caught up with her. Captain Carter, the aircraft hasn't been flight certified, and I certified it myself last month. She didn't look at him. She was walking. I've been maintaining it for 2 years, every system, every panel, every wire. I know that aircraft better than I know anything else on this base. The control tower won't authorize launch. Command will deny. I know. Then she stopped walking. She turned to look at him, and in the harsh fluorescent light of the tarmac, he could see something in her face that he could not quite name. Something that was not quite anger, and not quite grief, and not quite the specific kind of courage that comes from having nothing left to lose, but that contained elements of all 3. Go back to Commander Walsh, she said. Tell her I need 4 minutes. For what? For her to be somewhere else when I start the engines. Martinez stared at her, then he nodded. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come, and he walked quickly, because 4 minutes was not very long at all. Shadow One sat in this far corner of the eastern hangar like a held breath. It was an older aircraft by the standards of current military aviation, not ancient, but past the age where most machines of its type would still be in service. The airframe had been repaired following the Black Hollow mission 2 years ago, but the repairs had been classified as temporary, and the aircraft had never been returned to the active roster. It sat. It waited. Emily came to check its systems 3 times a week minimum, and on nights when sleep was particularly uninterested in visiting her, she came more often than that. She walked up to it now and pressed her palm flat against the fuselage. The metal was cold under her hand. You ready? She said quietly to the aircraft. She was aware that talking to machines was not rational. She was aware of it and had been aware of it for 20 years and had done it anyway because there are some things you do not explain, you simply do. She climbed up into the cockpit. The seat felt the way it always felt when she sat in it, like the one place on this base on this earth where she was precisely the right shape and size for the space available. She ran the pre-flight check from memory, her hands moving across the instruments with the automatic fluency of a person speaking their native language after years of speaking only in translation. Everything was ready. Everything had always been ready. She had made sure of that. She flipped the ignition sequence. The engines caught. Shadow One came alive around her, vibration and power and the particular voice of a machine that had been silent for too long, and was now remembering what it was made for. The sound moved through the metal, up through the seat, into her spine, into the bones of her hands, where they wrapped around the controls. At the communications console, a voice crackled through her headset. Aircraft in Eastern Hangar, this is tower control. You are not authorized for takeoff. Repeat, you are not authorized. Shut down engines and identify yourself immediately. Emily reached up and adjusted her headset. Tower control, this is Captain Emily Carter. I'm aware that I'm not authorized. I'm going anyway. A beat of silence. Then, Captain Carter, I am ordering you to shut down that aircraft. The general has been notified. Tell the general, Emily said, that I'll file the paperwork when I get back. She throttled up. The tower was still talking when Shadow One moved out of the hangar and onto the tarmac, and the tower was still talking when she turned the nose toward the runway, and the tower was talking when she pushed the throttle to full and the aircraft began to accelerate. And then she was in the air and the tower's voice faded into something she no longer needed to hear. Because what she needed now was ahead of her in the darkness, in the mountains, in the canyon where 9 men were waiting. Back in the command center, the alert came in with the kind of sudden disorienting clarity of something that everyone had considered impossible and had therefore not properly prepared for. Tower reports unauthorized takeoff, single aircraft, eastern runway, Captain Emily Carter. General Holt looked up from his desk. For a moment he was utterly still. Then he said with great precision, "Get me that aircraft on the radio. Now." The communications officer worked for 45 seconds and then looked up with an expression that Holt found genuinely unsettling. "She's not responding to our frequency, sir." "Is she receiving?" "Yes, sir, she's receiving," which meant she knew they were calling, which meant she was choosing not to answer. Holt stood up. He walked to the window again, and this time there was something outside to look at the navigation lights of Shadow One, already small with distance, already climbing, already turning toward the mountains. "Can we stop her?" someone asked from behind him. He watched the lights get smaller. "Not without shooting her down," he said, and his voice was very flat and very even. Nobody in the room said anything, because they all knew that he wouldn't do that. And they all knew, though none of them would say it aloud at that moment, that they were desperately quietly in the most private and unexpressed corner of themselves, hoping that she made it. Patricia Walsh was standing in the doorway of the communications room when the message came in from Raven Squad's frequency. It was faint, barely legible through the interference, but she recognized the voice. Sergeant Reeves again. He sounded different now. He sounded like a man who was past fear and had arrived somewhere else entirely, somewhere quieter and smaller, where the only thing left was the waiting. "Phoebe Carson, this is Raven Squad. We're still here, holding position. Ammunition, we have maybe 8 minutes of sustained fire. Both critical casualties stable but deteriorating. Request any update on extraction status. Anything. Over." Walsh pressed the transmit key. "Raven Squad, this is Commander Walsh. Hold your position. Help is coming." A long pause. Then Reeves' voice, and there was something in it that Walsh would carry with her for the rest of her life, a quality of exhausted, careful hope. The hope of a person who has almost stopped hoping and is terrified to start again. "Commander Walsh, please confirm. Did you say help is coming?" "I confirm, Sergeant. Help is coming." "Who, which aircraft?" Walsh looked out through the window at the darkness where Shadow One's lights had already disappeared into the distance. "The best one we've got," she said. "Inside the canyon, deep in the shadow and the cold, and the particular silence of a place where violence has recently been and is about to be." Again, the 9 men of Raven Squad had arranged themselves in the best defensive configuration available to them, which was not a good configuration because the location they had been forced into did not offer good options. It offered surviving options and dying options, and they had chosen the surviving ones, and they were managing to exist inside that choice by the thinnest of margins. Private First Class Tommy Alvarez was 19 years old. He had joined the Army because his older brother had joined the Army, and his older brother had come home intact and proud and full of stories, and Tommy had wanted stories of his own. He had not imagined that a story would feel like this, like cold rock against his back, and the sound of his own heartbeat too loud in his ears, and the knowledge sitting in his chest like a stone that nobody was coming. He had believed nobody was coming. And then Sergeant Reeves had appeared next to him in the dark, and Reeves' face had a look on it that Tommy could not read. "Walsh says help is coming," Reeves said. Tommy looked at him. "You believe her?" Reeves was quiet for a moment. He was a man who did not say things he didn't mean, and Tommy had learned to read the silences between his words as carefully as the words themselves. "I believe she believes it," Reeves said. "That's not the same thing." "No," Reeves agreed, "it's not." They sat with that for a while. Then from somewhere in the darkness above them, beyond the canyon walls, beyond the mountain and the enemy, and the cold and the impossibility of their situation, something reached them. A sound, the sound of an engine, not a distant sound, not an ambiguous sound, a specific, unmistakable sound that every one of them recognized in the same instant, the sound of an aircraft coming toward them, coming in low and fast along the canyon approach, that everyone at FOB Carson had classified as unnavigable after dark. Tommy grabbed Reeves' arm. Reeves was already listening. Around them, the other men of Raven Squad went still, all of them turning their faces toward the sound, all of them doing the same thing that Tommy was doing, the thing human beings do when they have given up on rescue and rescue shows up anyway. They held their breath. They listened. The engine sound grew louder. And Tommy Alvarez, 19 years old, 3,000 miles from home, with cold rock against his back and a stone of certainty dissolving in his chest, said something that came out barely above a whisper. "Someone's actually coming." Reeves put a hand on his shoulder. "Hold your position," he said. But there was something in his voice now, something that hadn't been there before, something that sounded impossibly like the beginning of the possibility of relief. And above them, in the dark, in the canyon called Black Hollow Shadow, one crossed the mountain ridge and began its descent. Emily Carter's hands were perfectly steady on the controls. Her hands were always steady. That was the thing about Emily Carter that people remembered who had seen her fly, not the decisions she made, not the maneuvers she executed, not the courage or the recklessness or whatever word you chose to describe, what she did in situations where other pilots found themselves running out of options. It was the hands, always steady, as if whatever was happening outside the cockpit had been agreed upon in advance and was proceeding exactly according to plan. The canyon walls rose on either side of her, and she did not look at them. She looked ahead. She thought about the wind patterns, the specific, particular, brutally personal wind patterns of Black Hollow that she had spent 2 years trying to forget and had failed to forget because some knowledge is not stored in the part of the mind that forgetting can reach. She felt the aircraft move through the air, and she felt the canyon's breath around her, and she made adjustments that were too small and too fast to be deliberate in any way that a flight instructor would recognize, because what she was doing was not flying by training. She was flying by something older than training. And somewhere below her in the dark, 9 men were listening to her engine and beginning against every expectation and every probability and every cold calculation that had been made in warm rooms by people looking at maps to believe that they might get out of this alive. General Holt stood at the window of his office and watched the radio operators and the communications officers doing their jobs in the room below, and he thought about the decision he had made, and he thought about the woman who had just overruled it, and he thought about the 9 men in the canyon, and he thought about the aircraft that was in the air right now, the aircraft that he had not authorized, that was flying a mission he had forbidden, that was going somewhere he had declared impossible to go. I thought about all of this for a long time. Then he turned to the aide standing behind him and said in a very quiet voice, "Prepare the rescue helicopters for launch." The aide blinked. "Sir, you said—" "I know what I said." Holt picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. "Get them ready. The moment we have confirmation that Carter has engaged enemy positions, I want those helicopters in the air. And Captain Carter, sir, the unauthorized." "Captain Carter," Holt said slowly, "is doing what needs to be done." He paused at the door. Sometimes the bravest thing a commander can do is admit that they were wrong before it's too late. He walked out of the room, and in the canyon below in the dark shadow, one went to war. Emily's voice came through the radio at 12:23 in the morning, and it was the steadiest thing in the building. "FOB Carson, this is Shadow One. I am in the canyon. I have visual on enemy positions. I am engaging. Send the rescue birds now." Walsh was already at the communications station. "Shadow One, copy that. Rescue helicopters are rolling. ETA 14 minutes. Can you hold?" A pause. The pause lasted exactly 4 seconds, and Walsh counted every one of them. Then Emily Carter's voice came back, and it was steady, and it was certain, and it was the voice of a woman who had made her choice a long time ago and was simply executing it now. "I'll hold," she said, and she did. The radio silence that followed General Holt's order lasted exactly 47 seconds. Patricia Walsh counted every one of them, standing in the doorway of the command room, her hand still gripping the doorframe, her eyes fixed on the communications console where the green transmission light had just gone dark. 47 seconds of a room full of trained military professionals staring at each other like people who had just witnessed something they did not have the correct language to describe. Then everyone started talking at once. "Sir, we still have a fix on their position. The rescue window is closing fast. 2 critical casualties if we don't move in the next..." Holt raised one hand, flat, palm out. The room went quiet with the mechanical precision of people who had been conditioned to obey that gesture without processing whether obedience was the right response. "The decision has been made," Holt said. His voice was the same temperature it had been when he gave the order. Not cold, not hot, just level. The voice of a man who had made peace with what he had done before he had done it. "We will not be revisiting it. Everyone return to your stations." He walked out. Walsh watched him go. She stood in the doorway for 3 more seconds. Then she turned to Martinez, who had appeared at her elbow at some point during the previous 90 seconds and had the expression of a man trying to decide which direction the exit was. "Eastern hangar," she said. Now they moved. The corridor between the command building and the eastern tarmac was 260 meters long. Walsh knew this because she had walked it approximately 400 times in the past 18 months, but she had never walked it the way she walked it tonight, fast enough that her footsteps had an edge to them, slow enough that she could think what she needed to do, because what she was about to do required thinking, even if the decision itself required no thought at all. Martinez matched her pace. "Ma'am, if the general finds out you went directly to Carter after he gave the order." "He'll find out," Walsh said, and then he'll deal with it." She pushed through the exterior door and the night air hit her cold and absolute. "That's later. Right now we have 9 men with maybe 90 minutes, and the only person alive who knows that canyon is 30 seconds away from us. She hasn't flown in 2 years. She's been maintaining Shadow 1 for 2 years." Walsh didn't look at him. There's a difference between a pilot who hasn't flown and a pilot who hasn't been allowed to fly. Emily Carter falls into the second category. Martinez was quiet for a moment. "Do you think she'll actually do it?" Walsh thought about Emily Carter. She thought about the file she had read, not the official file, but the real one, the one that existed in the testimonies of the people who had been in that canyon 2 years ago, when Emily had flown in alone and brought them out. She thought about what those soldiers had said in their own words, about what it felt like to hear that engine coming. "I think," Walsh said carefully, "that the harder question is whether we have any right to ask her." She pushed open the hangar door before Martinez could respond to that. The hangar smelled the way it always smelled, hydraulic fluid and metal, and the particular staleness of a space that processes work, but not people. Most of the overhead lights were off at this hour. The working light came from a single lamp positioned under the belly of a damaged cargo helicopter in the middle of the floor, and from that lamp's halo 2 boots were visible, attached to legs attached to a woman lying on a rolling board, doing something to the aircraft's hydraulic assembly, with both hands in the focused attention of a person who has long since stopped needing to think about what they're doing. Walsh stopped a few feet away. "Captain Carter." The boots didn't move. "Whatever it is," Emily said from under the aircraft, "find someone with current flight clearance. I'm on modified duty." Walsh crouched down so that she was at eye level with the gap under the aircraft. She could see Emily's face now, the side of it anyway, turned toward the hydraulic assembly, the jaw set with the concentration of the work. "It's black hollow," Walsh said. The hand stopped moving. The silence lasted 2 seconds, 3. Then Emily rolled out from under the aircraft, sat up and looked at Walsh directly, and Walsh saw something move through her face that happened too fast to fully track a sequence of things. Not all of them identifiable, but which included recognition and memory, and something that might have been pain, and something that might have been the particular stillness of a person who has just heard the one sentence they were always going to hear, eventually, and have been both dreading and waiting for. "Who?" Emily said. "Raven Squad, 9 men, 2 critical. They've been transmitting for the past hour." Walsh held her eyes. "The general has ordered no extraction. He's classified the mission as non-viable." Emily stood up. She pulled the rag from her pocket and wiped her hands, and the motion was automatic, completely automatic, her eyes never leaving Walsh's face. "He killed the radio," Emily said. Walsh blinked. "How did you..." Because that's what he would do. Emily's voice was flat, not angry, the flatness of someone describing a predictable outcome they had hoped would not come to pass. He wouldn't want to hear it. He wouldn't want anyone else to hear it. So he shut it off and wrote the paperwork. She finished wiping her hands. How long do the critical casualties have? The medic's last assessment, 90 minutes, maybe less. And nobody else is going in. No authorized aircraft. Emily looked at her for a moment. There was something in that look that Walsh could not entirely read an assessment, a calculation, but also something more personal than either of those things, something that had to do with the specific history between Emily Carter and the canyon called Black Hollow, that Walsh had read about in reports but had never had direct access to. I need you to be somewhere else, Emily said. Walsh understood immediately. She stood up. I need to make a phone call. I'll be in the communications room for the next 15 minutes. That's long enough, Emily said. Walsh turned to leave, then she stopped. She turned back. There were things she wanted to say, things about risk, things about the fact that Shadow One hadn't been flight certified in 20 months, things about what happened to pilots who violated direct orders from general officers, things that responsible people said to other people before they did something irreversible. She said none of them. What she said instead was, bring them home. Emily nodded once. Go make your phone call. Walsh went 12:01 a.m. Emily Carter stood alone in the hangar with Shadow One for exactly 30 seconds before she moved. She used those 30 seconds the way she had learned to use the seconds before every flight she had ever taken. That mattered not for thinking because the thinking was done, but for something harder to name. A kind of internal settlement. The moment when everything that was not relevant dropped away, and what remained was only the mission and the aircraft and the space between her and where she needed to go. She walked to Shadow One and pressed her palm against the fuselage. The metal was cold. Of course it was cold. It had been sitting in this hangar in the dark for 2 years, and metal holds cold, the way some things hold silence completely and without complaint. You've been waiting, she said quietly. She climbed up. The cockpit received her the way it always had, like a space that had been built around her specifically. She knew this was not true. She knew it was mechanical and physical and had nothing to do with recognition. She also knew that the knowing didn't change the feeling and that sometimes the feeling was information too. She ran the pre-flight check from memory. Her hands moved across the instruments with the clean, certain speed of repetition, so deep it had become reflex. Every system she touched responded exactly the way she had prepared it to respond, because she had never stopped preparing it, because somewhere under everything she had told herself about having moved on and accepted the new parameters of her life, she had known that it would not always be this way. The engines caught on the first attempt. The sound that came up through the airframe was not just mechanical. It was something she felt in her sternum, in the bones of her hands. Shadow One coming back to life after 2 years of waiting, and the feeling of it was something she did not have words for and did not try to find words for, because there are experiences that language approaches but cannot enter. 12:04 a.m. The control tower hit her immediately. Aircraft in Eastern Hangar, you are not authorized for takeoff. Shut down engines and identify yourself. Repeat, shut down engines immediately. Emily pressed the transmit button. Tower control, this is Captain Emily Carter. I know I'm not authorized. I'm going anyway. A pause. She could hear in the pause the tower operator doing the rapid internal calculation of a person who has just received information that does not fit any protocol they have been trained for. Captain Carter, I am ordering you to stand down. General Holt has been notified. If you attempt takeoff, I will have to... You'll have to do what you have to do, Shibon, Emily said. She throttled up. And so will I. She released the brakes. Shadow One moved. The tower was still talking. She stopped listening to the tower. She focused instead on the tarmac ahead of her, the runway, the darkness beyond the runway, and the mountains beyond the darkness, where 9 men were counting down the last minutes of whatever time they had left. She felt the aircraft accelerate under her, felt the familiar pressure of speed building, felt the moment, that specific, unrepeatable, absolutely unmistakable moment when the ground released its claim on the machine and the air took over. Shadow One lifted. Emily Carter flew. 12:06 a.m. The alert hit the command center like a stone through glass. General Holt, unauthorized takeoff, Eastern runway. Captain Emily Carter, Shadow One is airborne. Holt was at his desk when the aide delivered the information. He was reviewing casualty projections for a separate operation, a different mountain, a different set of numbers. And he looked up from the papers with the expression of a man who has been surprised but is working very hard not to show it. Shadow 1, he repeated. Yes, sir. She's already off the runway, turning east, climbing fast. Holt put down his pen. He stood up. He walked to the window, and this time there was something in the sky to look at the navigation lights of Shadow 1, already climbing, already turning, already pointing herself at the mountains like an accusation. Can we stop her? Someone asked. Holt watched the lights. Not without shooting her down, he said. The room went very quiet. Holt continued watching the lights until they were no longer visible. Then he turned around and he looked at the room full of people who were watching him with the carefully neutral expressions of people trying very hard not to reveal what they were thinking, and he understood with sudden unwelcome clarity exactly what they were thinking. They were thinking that they hoped she made it. They were thinking that a woman who had been removed from active flight for 2 years flying an aircraft that hadn't been flight certified in 20 months going alone into the most dangerous piece of airspace in the region, they were hoping she made it not just for the sake of Raven Squad, but because they were all sitting in a room where a general had just turned off the radio on 9 living men, and they needed someone to make that not be the end of the story. Holt looked at his aide. Prepare the rescue helicopters. The aide blinked. Sir, you said. I know what I said. His voice was even. Prepare them. The moment we have confirmation that Carter has engaged enemy positions, I want them airborne. He picked up his jacket. And somebody get me Walsh on the radio. Commander Walsh is in the communications room, sir. Of course she is. He put on his jacket. Tell her I want a full channel open to Shadow 1. Everything Carter transmits, I want to hear it. He walked out. The rescue helicopters began to move. 12:09 a.m. Inside Black Hollow, the math had gotten very simple. Sergeant Daniel Reeves had spent the last 40 minutes reducing everything in his situation to numbers, because numbers were honest in a way that feelings were not, and honesty was what he needed right now. Numbers of rounds remaining. Numbers of minutes the critical casualties could sustain their current condition. Numbers of enemy contact points he had visually confirmed. Numbers of exits from their current position. The last number was the one that kept coming up the same no matter how many times he ran it. 0. Private Tommy Alvarez had been watching Reeves do the math. Tommy was 19 and he hadn't been doing math. He had been doing something else, the thing you do when math runs out, which is not prayer exactly because Tommy had not been to church since he was 12, but which was close enough to prayer that the distinction felt academic. Sarge, Tommy said quietly. Yeah. Are they coming? Reeves looked at him. In the darkness, Tommy's face was very young. It was always young, but it was particularly young right now, with the particular youth of someone confronting the possibility that the story they're in is not going to resolve the way stories are supposed to resolve. Walsh said help is coming, Reeves told him. But do you believe her? Reeves had answered this question once already tonight. He had said, I believe she believes it. And Tommy had said, that's not the same thing. And Reeves had said, no, it's not. But something had shifted since then. Something Reeves couldn't entirely account for, some internal movement, the way a scale tips when someone adds weight too small to see. Yeah, Reeves said. I believe her. Tommy stared at him. Since when? Since about a minute ago. What happened a minute ago? I don't know, Reeves said. He stopped. He cocked his head slightly to one side. Do you hear that? Tommy went still. From somewhere above them, beyond the canyon walls, beyond the darkness in the rock, in the enemy positions they had been tracking for the past hour, a sound reached them. Faint, directional, moving, an engine. That's an aircraft, Tommy whispered. Yeah. Coming this way. Yeah. Tommy grabbed Reeves' arm with both hands, the grip of a person who needs physical contact to verify that what they are experiencing is real. Sarge, that's an aircraft coming toward us. That's someone's actually. Hold your position, Reeves said. But his voice was different now. Something in it had changed. Something that had been very tight had loosened just slightly, just enough to let air through. Hold your position and stay down. Around them, the other men of Raven Squad had gone still. All of them had heard it. All of them were doing the same thing, turning their faces upward. Listening, performing the instinctive and entirely irrational act of trying to see sound. The engine grew louder. Reeves pressed his radio transmit button. FOB Carson, this is Raven Squad. We have audio contact with an incoming aircraft. Please confirm. Over. Walsh's voice came back immediately, and there was something in it, a quality of relief so strong it had pushed through her professional composure and was audible in the transmission. Raven Squad, that is confirmed. Shadow 1 is in the canyon. Hold your position. Stay down. Rescue helicopters are 14 minutes out. 14 minutes. Reeves closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. 14 minutes was a very long time. 14 minutes was also, for the first time in the past 3 hours, a number that seemed conceivably survivable. He opened his eyes. You heard her? 14 minutes. Everyone stay down, stay covered, conserve ammunition. We are getting out of here. He looked at Tommy. Tommy's face had done something remarkable. The youth that had been there before, that particular painful youth of someone confronting the unresolvable, was still there, but something else was there too now. Something that had climbed up through it and was sitting on top of it. Hope. Terrible, fragile, desperate hope. The kind you can't afford and can't stop. 12:11 a.m. Emily entered the canyon at an angle that the tactical manual classified as extremely inadvisable, and that her body classified as correct. She felt the canyon walls rise around the aircraft, the way she had felt them rise 2 years ago. Not as a threat exactly, but as a presence, a conversation between the aircraft and the rock that required her complete and undivided participation. She did not look at the walls. She watched the air. She felt it. The wind inside Black Hollow moved the way it had always moved, not randomly, but according to its own logic. A logic built from the shape of the canyon and the temperature differentials between the rock and the air, and the thousand small physical facts that accumulated into a pattern that could not be taught but could be learned if you survived long enough to learn it. Emily had survived. She had spent 2 years telling herself that the survival had cost her something she could never get back. And maybe that was true. But what the survival had given her, sitting in the cockpit of Shadow 1 at this particular moment, was everything. The first enemy position opened fire at 12:13 a.m. The tracer rounds came up from the canyon floor at an angle that told Emily 3 things simultaneously: the position of the shooter, the elevation of the weapon, and the pattern of fire that the shooter was trained to use. She processed all 3 pieces of information in the same instant that she moved the aircraft not away from the fire, not up and out of the canyon, but sideways and down, a movement that made no sense to anyone who wasn't inside her understanding of the airspace, and that resulted in the tracer rounds passing through the space where Shadow 1 had been 2 seconds earlier. She hit her radio. FOB Carson, Shadow 1. First enemy contact, northeast canyon wall, approximately 200 meters below ridge. I'm engaging. Walsh's voice, copy Shadow 1. Rescue birds are 12 minutes out. Tell them to come in from the southwest approach. I'll keep the northeast clear. Understood. Shadow 1, be advised, we're tracking at least 3 additional enemy positions on the canyon floor. I see them, Emily said. She didn't elaborate. There wasn't time. The second position opened fire 30 seconds later, and she was already moving before the first round left the barrel because she had seen the shooter shift position in the peripheral data of everything she was tracking, and anticipation was faster than reaction. Shadow 1 moved through the canyon like a thought, like something that had decided to happen and was happening regardless of what the physics of the situation technically permitted. 12:16 a.m. Back at FOB Carson, the command center had undergone a transformation that nobody had explicitly authorized and nobody was trying to stop. People who had been at their own stations doing their own jobs had gravitated by ones and twos towards the main communications console where the open channel to Shadow 1 was broadcasting. They stood in a rough semicircle around the console listening, and what they heard was the voice of Emily Carter delivering brief, precise, completely calm tactical updates between maneuvers that their instruments told them should not be physically possible. Third position suppressed, moving to northwest approach. 4 incoming from the ridge, engaging. Canyon floors clearing. Tell the rescue birds they have a window. One of the junior communications officers, a young woman named Specialist Chen, who had been on shift for 14 hours and whose professional composure was roughly held together with the equivalent of tape and prayers, turned to the senior officer next to her and said in a voice slightly above a whisper, "Is she doing what I think she's doing?" The senior officer didn't look away from the console. "She's clearing the canyon," he said. Single aircraft. She's clearing the whole canyon. Chen stared at the display. Alone, alone. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then she said with the simple honesty of someone who has run out of professional language, for what they're observing, that's not possible. I know, the senior officer said. They kept listening. 12:19 a.m. General Holt stood in the doorway of the command center and listened to Emily Carter's transmissions and did not move and did not speak. He had been standing there for 3 minutes. Nobody had acknowledged his presence because everyone in the room was too focused on the console to notice much of anything else. And Holt was not a man who required acknowledgement, particularly at moments when his attention was entirely claimed by something else. He listened to Shadow One move through Black Hollow, and he thought about a lot of things, and most of what he thought about, he would not have been able to articulate clearly. But one thing he thought about was the moment he had turned off the radio, and what had been in the room in the second after he did it, and what had been in his own chest in that same second, something that he had moved through quickly, too quickly. Because quick movement was how you got through those moments when you were a commander. Because the alternative was not moving at all. What had been in his chest was the thing he had told himself was not possible. Doubt. He had turned off the radio because he could not afford to sit in a room and listen to 9 men die when there was nothing to be done about it. He had turned it off because the calculation was clear and the risk was too high and the decision was correct. He had also turned it off because listening to them would have made the doubt louder and he could not afford louder. He stood in the doorway now and listened to a woman he had grounded, flying an aircraft. He had decommissioned doing something he had classified as impossible, and the doubt that he had tried to silence was no longer whispering. It was very quiet in his head, too quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after something breaks. General, his aide appeared at his elbow. Rescue helicopters are 6 minutes from the canyon entrance. Holt nodded, and Shadow One, still transmitting, sir. She's still in there. Still in there. Holt closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he walked into the room and stood next to the console and said, open a channel to Shadow One. I want to talk to her. The operator looked up, opened the channel, nodded. Holt pressed the transmit key. Shadow One, this is General Holt. I am authorizing your current mission retroactively. Whatever you needed is approved. Over. The channel was open. They could hear the background noise of the cockpit, the engine, the wind through the canyon, the faint sounds of a machine working at the edge of its operational limits. Then Emily's voice, as steady as it had been at the beginning. Appreciate that, General. Tell the rescue birds they have clear approach on southwest vector. I've got the northeast. Over. Holt stared at the console for a moment, then very quietly, so quietly that only the operator next to him could possibly have heard it, he said, copy that, Captain. He did not let go of the transmit key immediately. He held it for a second, which was not standard procedure, but nothing about this moment was standard procedure. Bring them home, he said. 12:22 a.m. Tommy Alvarez heard the change in the canyon before he understood it. For the past hour, the sounds around Raven Squad had been the sounds of a trap closing weapons fire movement in the rocks above the specific acoustic signature of an enclosed space being organized against them. It had been getting louder and more precise, the tightening of something around them. And then at 12:13, something had changed. The fire that had been directed at their position began redirecting, not stopping redirecting, as if the enemy positions that had been focused on Raven Squad had suddenly found a more urgent target. They're pulling off of us, one of the men said, not quite believing it. Shadow One is drawing their fire, Reeves said. She's one aircraft, someone else said. Against all of those positions? I know. Sarge, I know. Reeves's voice was sharp, not angry, just sharp with the edge of a person who understands the mathematics of what is happening and is choosing deliberately and consciously not to perform a full accounting of it. Our job is to hold position and be ready to move when the rescue birds arrive. That's it. That's all we do. Can everyone do that? Silence. Then one by one the affirmatives came in. Good, Reeves said. He pressed himself against the rock and listened to the engine of Shadow One moving through the canyon overhead. And he thought about a pilot he had never met flying alone into the thing that everyone else had decided was impossible. And he felt something in his chest that he would not describe to anyone for a long time, because the words for it were the words for things that happened to other people in other stories. Not to a sergeant from Denton, Texas, holding a radio in a canyon in Afghanistan at 12:22 in the morning. The words were "Someone came for us." 12:24 a.m. Emily's instrument panel lit up with three warnings simultaneously. Fuel she had expected. She had calculated the fuel consumption against the mission timeline before she entered the canyon and knew exactly how much margin she had, which was not much. The fuel warning was information, not surprise. The second warning was the hydraulic pressure indicator. One of the systems she had been nursing for the past 2 years, one of the systems she knew best, which meant she knew exactly what it was telling her and exactly how much time she had before it became critical. The third warning was the one she had not planned for. One of the anti-aircraft positions she had assessed as suppressed had not been suppressed. It had been waiting, and it had just found her. The round didn't hit the aircraft directly. It hit close enough that the pressure wave pushed Shadow 1 sideways and down in a movement that was outside the parameters of controlled flight, and Emily had approximately 1 second to decide between two things: the instinctive response, which would have resulted in the aircraft hitting the canyon wall, and the correct response, which was counterintuitive and violent, and which she executed with the steadiness that had always lived in her hands. Shadow 1 came back to level. The cockpit was full of alarms. Emily silenced the ones she didn't need and categorized the ones she did. The aircraft was damaged. The extent of the damage she would assess in the next 30 seconds, while simultaneously making sure she didn't die in the next 5. She keyed her radio. Her voice was completely even. FOB Carson, Shadow 1. I've taken damage. Non-critical at this time. Enemy position at Southeast Canyon Base is active and suppressed. I'm re-engaging. Rescue birds do not change approach vector. From the command center, Walsh's voice. Shadow 1, say again, did you take a hit? Affirmative. Are you able to maintain flight? Emily looked at her instruments. She looked at the hydraulic pressure reading. She looked at the fuel. She looked at the damage assessment her instruments were providing and cross-referenced it against the knowledge she had built over 2 years of working on this specific machine. Affirmative, she said. Shadow 1 is maintaining flight. She turned back toward the southeast position. She didn't mention that the hydraulic pressure was dropping faster than the instrument had suggested it would. She didn't mention that the fuel warning had moved from yellow to orange. She didn't mention any of this because the rescue helicopters were 4 minutes out and Raven Squad needed 4 more minutes of cover. And there were things you said on the radio and things you didn't say on the radio. And the things you didn't say were the ones that would cause the people listening to make different decisions than the ones they needed to make. The thing about flying, Emily had once tried to explain to a younger pilot who had asked her about fear, is that fear is information. Fear tells you what the situation is, but fear is not instructions. Fear tells you what's there. You decide what to do about it. She had been afraid exactly 3 times in her career. Genuinely afraid, not the managed alertness that most people called fear, but which was actually just heightened awareness. She had been afraid the first time she flew into Black Hollow 2 years ago. She had been afraid the morning they told her she would never fly again. And she was afraid now. She used the information. She decided what to do about it. She went back into the canyon. 12:26 a.m. The rescue helicopters crossed the mountain ridge and began their descent. At the console in FOB Carson, the room was so quiet that Walsh could hear the person next to her breathing. On the channel, Emily's voice, southwest approach is clear. I have the northeast. Come in now. The rescue helicopter lead pilot's voice. Shadow 1, we have you on visual. Coming in. Copy. Move fast. I'm managing southeast position, but they're persistent. Understood. Shadow 1, what's your status? A pause, short pause, the kind of pause that people who knew Emily Carter would later say contained the most information of anything she transmitted that night. I'm here, she said. Keep moving. Walsh closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them and watched the display as 2 rescue helicopters descended into Black Hollow Canyon, guided by the aircraft of a woman who had been told she was finished, toward 9 men who had been told they were forgotten. The canyon for the first time gave them room, because Shadow 1 was making sure it did. 12:28 a.m. Tommy Alvarez heard the helicopters before he saw them, and when he heard them, he did something he had not done since he was about 6 years old, which was that he grabbed the arm of the man next to him and said out loud with no concern whatsoever for his reputation as a soldier, "They're here. They're actually here." Reeves grabbed his shoulder. "Move now, let's go. Everyone move." The extraction was fast. It was not clean. Clean was not available in this canyon on this night, but it was fast. The critical casualties went first. Then the rest of the squad, two by two under Reeves' direction, each movement covered by the man before and covering the man after. The last one in was Reeves himself. As he ducked through the helicopter door, he looked up. Above them, Shadow One circled. The aircraft was not moving smoothly. Even from the ground, even in the dark, Reeves could see that the flight was not what it should be. There was something in the movement of the aircraft that suggested it was working harder than it should be working, that the margins were tighter than anyone on the ground knew. But it was circling, it was staying, it was keeping the approaches clear until the last human being was aboard. Reeves stared at it for a moment. The helicopter door closed. And above them, Shadow One kept circling, kept working, kept standing between Raven Squad and every threat that wanted to end their story tonight, because the pilot inside it had made a decision somewhere over a mountain at 12 minutes past midnight. And that decision was still in effect, and it would remain in effect until every person who needed to be safe was safe. That was the kind of decision Emily Carter made. That was the kind of person she was. And the men of Raven Squad, lifting away from Black Hollow Canyon into the cold, dark air above the mountains, were only just beginning to understand the full weight of what that meant. The rescue helicopters cleared the canyon ridge at 12:31 a.m., and the moment they did, the entire command center at FO Carson exhaled as one. Not cheered, not celebrated, exhaled. The way you exhale when something that has been sitting on your chest for 2 hours suddenly lifts, and the relief is so physical and so total that it expresses itself not in words but in the simple act of breathing correctly again. Walsh watched the display. Both helicopters climbing. Both helicopters intact. The transponder signals from Raven Squad's personnel beacons, all 9 of them, all 9 still active, moving upward and away from Black Hollow. 9 signals, all 9. She pressed both hands flat on the console and leaned her weight into them and did not say anything for a moment, because there was nothing to say that the numbers hadn't already said better. Then Specialist Chen's voice came from 2 stations over, urgent and stripped of all the professional composure that Chen had been carefully maintaining for the past 30 minutes. Commander Walsh, Shadow One. Walsh straightened immediately. What about her? She's still in the canyon. The exhale stopped. Walsh crossed to Chen's station in 4 steps. The display showed 2 rescue helicopters climbing Northeast 9 personnel beacons, moving with them all, correct, all expected. And 1 more transponder signal south and lower, moving in a pattern that Walsh stared at for 2 full seconds before her brain resolved what she was seeing. Shadow One was not following the rescue helicopters out. Shadow One was going deeper into the canyon. Get her on the channel, Walsh said. Chen already had the frequency open. Shadow One, this is FOB Carson. Rescue helicopters have cleared the canyon. You are clear to exit. Repeat, you are clear to exit. Over. Static, then Emily's voice, and even through the interference, Walsh could hear something in it that had not been there 20 minutes ago. A tightness, a quality of controlled strain, like a cable under more tension than it was designed for, but not yet at the breaking point. FOB Carson, Shadow One, I have a secondary contact, canyon floor southeast. They're repositioning toward the rescue helicopter flight path. I'm staying to suppress. Walsh grabbed the transmit key. Shadow One, the helicopters are out of range. They're clear. You don't need to. They're not out of range yet. Emily's voice didn't rise. It never rose. They will be in 4 minutes. I need 4 minutes. Over. Walsh looked at the display. She looked at Shadow One's transponder. She looked at the damage assessment data that had been coming in on the secondary channel since 12,024, the hydraulic pressure reading that was now in the red, the fuel state that had moved from orange to something that the instrument described as critical, and that Walsh's own experience translated as almost gone. She pressed the transmit key. Shadow One, your fuel state is critical. Your hydraulics are compromised. You need to exit the canyon now. Silence. 4 seconds of silence, and in those 4 seconds, Walsh heard something that she would remember for the rest of her career. Not words, but the quality of an open channel, the sound of a cockpit where someone was making a decision. Then 4 minutes, Commander, I'll be fine, over. Walsh stared at the transmitter. She knew Emily Carter was lying. She also knew that Emily Carter knew she was lying. And she knew with a certainty that sat in her chest like a stone that there was nothing she could say into that radio that would bring Shadow One out of that canyon 1 second before Emily Carter decided to bring it out herself. She released the transmit key. Keep the channel open, she told Chen. Every second. Yes, ma'am. Walsh stood at the console and watched the display and waited, and the 4 minutes that Emily had asked for began their count. And every one of them was the longest Walsh had experienced since she had stood in a different room, listening to a different transmission, and wondering whether the people sending it would still be alive when it ended. 12:32 a.m. Emily knew the fuel number. She had known it for 6 minutes. She had been tracking it the way you track something that is going to matter very soon and that you cannot do anything about except account for it in your planning. The planning at this point was simple. The secondary enemy position on the canyon floor had repositioned while the rescue helicopters were extracting Raven Squad using the cover of the extraction activity to move northwest, which put them on a vector that would have given them a firing solution on the departing helicopters for approximately 3 minutes after they cleared the canyon walls. 3 minutes was a very long time in terms of what a surface-to-air weapon could accomplish. Emily had seen the repositioning at 12:29. She had not mentioned it to the command center because mentioning it would have prompted a conversation about whether she should engage it, and she did not have time for that conversation, and the outcome of it was not in question anyway. She was going to suppress it. She was going to suppress it until the rescue helicopters were fully out of range. And then she was going to have a very serious conversation with her fuel gauge about whether the aircraft was capable of the exit flight. The canyon at 12:32 a.m. was a different environment than it had been when she had entered it. She had spent 20 minutes reshaping it, not physically, obviously, but tactically, the way a person reshapes a room by changing where the dangerous things are. The northeast positions that had been the primary threat when she entered were suppressed or destroyed. The northwest approach was clear. The canyon floor along the primary extraction corridor was clear. What remained was the southeast position repositioned patient, waiting for the helicopter's extended departure window. She engaged it at 12:33. The response was immediate and heavier than she had anticipated. This was not a single position. It was 3 positions coordinated, which meant they had been waiting for her to commit to a single attack vector, which meant they had anticipated her, which meant that whoever was commanding the enemy forces in this canyon tonight was thinking 3 moves ahead. Emily processed this information in approximately half a second. Then she did something that the tactical manual described as an extreme risk maneuver and that she thought of as the only thing that made sense given what was in front of her. She went lower. 12:33 a.m. In the command center, Specialist Chen said, "Oh God," very quietly, and then immediately pressed her hand over her mouth as if she could take the words back. Walsh looked at the display. Shadow 1's altitude reading had dropped 40 meters in 6 seconds. "She went low," someone said from across the room. "She's below the position line. She's using the canyon floor for cover," Walsh said. Her voice was steady. It was steady the way Emily's was steady, not because she was not afraid, but because she had decided that steady was the only acceptable option. "She's putting the terrain between herself and the firing positions. At that altitude, if she touches, she won't touch," Walsh said. She said it with a certainty she did not entirely possess. But she said it because the alternative was saying something else, and saying something else would not help Emily Carter. And it would not help the people in that room. And the only thing that helped anyone right now was the next 4 minutes passing without the transponder signal on that display going still. 12:34 a.m., Emily was flying by feel now. This was not metaphor. This was technical reality. At the altitude she was at, with the hydraulic system delivering inconsistent pressure to the control surfaces, the instruments were giving her information that was useful but incomplete, and completing it required the other inputs. The way the aircraft moved in response to her hands, the air pressure through the fuselage, the sound of the engine, which she could feel as much as hear through the seat and the controls. She had been flying long enough that these inputs had bypassed the analytical part of her brain entirely and gone straight to response. She was not thinking about what to do. She was doing it. The 3 positions were firing at her. She was not where they were firing. She was where they would have fired if they had accounted for the hydraulic inconsistency in her flight path, which they could not have accounted for because they did not know her aircraft had a hydraulic problem. They were calculating based on a fully functional aircraft, and she was flying a partially functional one, and the gap between those 2 calculations was keeping her alive. This was not a strategy she had planned. This was the kind of thing that happens when you know your aircraft well enough to use its failures as assets. She had maintained Shadow One for 2 years. She knew every failure it had. She had, without ever explicitly framing it this way, prepared for this exact situation. At 12:35, the hydraulic pressure dropped to a level that changed the parameters of the conversation she was having with the aircraft's controls. The response in the stick was still there, but it was slower, not dangerously slow, but slow enough that the gap between intention and execution had widened, and flying in a canyon at low altitude, with a narrower margin between intention and execution, was a different experience than flying with a normal margin. She adjusted. She had always adjusted. That was the thing about Emily Carter that the people who had flown with her over the years had tried to explain to the people who hadn't, and had generally failed to explain adequately because it was the kind of thing that was visible and not transmissible. Other pilots had skills. Emily Carter had adjustment, the capacity to read a changing situation faster than the situation was changing and be already in the right position when the change arrived. She was adjusting now. The three positions below her were also adjusting, and the quality of their coordination told her something she filed away for later. This was not ordinary enemy force disposition. Someone had planned specifically for an aircraft trying to clear this canyon. Someone had thought about this. She filed it and kept flying. 12:36 a.m. The rescue helicopters crossed into safe airspace at 12:36 and 18 seconds. In the helicopter carrying Raven Squad's critical casualties, the flight medic worked with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough that emergency had become a kind of rhythm. Sergeant Reeves sat across from the medic and watched his men and did the thing he had been doing all night, which was counting the faces he could see, counting the ones he had gotten out, counting the ones who were going to be okay. The numbers were good. The numbers were better than they had any right to be. But Reeves was also listening. Not to the medic, not to the engine, not to the communications chatter coming through the headset. He was listening for something else, something he was tracking from a distance through the aircraft walls and the night air and the miles that were accumulating between him and Black Hollow with every second. The sound of Shadow One's engine. He couldn't hear it anymore. He knew that. They were too far away and the helicopter was too loud. But he was listening for it anyway, the way you listen for the voice of someone you're worried about, even when you know they're not close enough to hear. "She's still in there," he said to no one in particular. The soldier next to him, Corporal James Witter, 26 from a small town in Ohio, that James described as the kind of place where interesting things never happened, looked up. "Shadow One, I am." "Yeah." James was quiet for a moment. "She went in alone." "Yeah. For us." Reeves looked at him. "Yeah." James looked at his hands for a moment. They were shaking slightly, not from fear exactly at this point, but from the aftermath of fear. The body processing what the mind had been too busy to deal with while it was happening. "I don't even know her name," he said. "Carter," Reeves said. "Emily Carter." James said the name quietly to himself, the way you say something you want to remember. 12:37 a.m. The fuel alarm stopped being a warning and became a statement. Emily had approximately 6 minutes of flight remaining. She had spent the past 4 minutes suppressing the southeast positions while simultaneously calculating and recalculating the exit route. And the calculation kept producing the same answer, which was that she needed to begin her exit now if she was going to make it out before the fuel ran out entirely. She keyed her radio. "FOB Carson, Shadow One. Rescue helicopters status." Walsh's voice came back immediately. Walsh had been waiting. Walsh had not moved from the console. "Shadow One rescue helicopters are in safe airspace. All 9 Raven Squad personnel are aboard and accounted for. You are clear to exit. Come out now. 6 minutes of fuel. Exit route northeast approach. 7 minutes minimum given current airspeed and damage state." She had already done this math. She had done it at 12:34 and arrived at the same answer she was arriving at now. The math said she was not going to make it out of the canyon with fuel remaining. The math said she was going to land or crash somewhere inside or immediately outside the canyon perimeter. The math said a lot of things, and she had listened to all of them, and she had kept flying anyway because the math at 12:29 had said she couldn't suppress 3 coordinated enemy positions with a compromised aircraft, and she had done that, so the math was not the final word. The math was information. "Shadow One is exiting," she told Walsh. "Northeast approach." "Copy. Shadow One, be advised our instruments show your fuel state as critical. Repeat, critical. What is your assessment?" She adjusted her heading. I'll make it. Emily, Walsh's voice changed. Not the commander anymore. Something more direct. Talk to me. What is your actual status? A pause, 2 seconds. Then for the first time in the entire mission, Emily Carter's voice on the radio had something in it other than level certainty. It wasn't fear. It wasn't despair. It was something simpler and more human than either of those things. It was honesty. I'm going to get as far as I can, she said. That's my actual status. The channel went quiet. Walsh heard it the way everyone in the command center heard it, as the specific sound of a person telling the truth about a situation that the truth did not improve. Then Walsh said with a steadiness that cost her something, "Copy that, Shadow One. We have recovery teams on standby. Whatever happens, we have you." "I know," Emily said, and she climbed. 12:38 a.m. The twist that nobody in the command center had seen coming arrived at 12:38, and it arrived in the form of a voice on a frequency that the communications officer, Southeast officer, had left open as a monitoring channel and that had until this moment been silent. It was the frequency of the enemy command net. And the reason the communications officer had it open was that the intelligence team had broken the encryption on it 40 minutes ago and had been listening, and what they had been hearing had been interesting, but not immediately actionable until 12:38, when the enemy commander's voice came through the channel with a clarity that suggested he was close, and a content that made the intelligence officer who was monitoring it push back from his station and say loudly enough that Walsh heard it from across the room. "Commander Walsh, you need to hear this, now." Walsh crossed the room. She put on the secondary headset. She listened for 8 seconds. Then she pulled the headset off and turned to the room with an expression that everyone who was watching would later describe differently. Some said it was fear. Some said it was fury. Some said it was the face of a person who has just understood that the situation they were managing was a different situation than the one they thought they were managing. What Walsh said was, "They're not trying to stop her from leaving." The room went still. "They're trying to guide her to a specific exit point." She turned to the display. "The northeast approach, the route she's currently taking, is where they want her to go. They have a position there. They set this up. The southeast positions were not the primary threat. They were bait." The silence that followed this was the silence of a room full of people, rapidly recalculating everything they had understood about the past 40 minutes. Then someone said, "We have to warn her." Walsh was already at the transmit key. "Shadow One, abort northeast approach. Repeat, abort northeast approach. We have intelligence. Northeast exit is compromised. Enemy prepared position at ridge. Do you copy? Static. Shadow One, do you copy? More static." Then Emily's voice and the tightness in it had increased. She was climbing, which meant the engine was working harder, which meant the fuel was dropping faster. "FOB Carson, I'm reading you broken. Say again your last." Walsh pressed the key. "Northeast approach is a trap. Abort. Do you copy? Northeast is a trap." The static was worse now. The canyon walls, the altitude change, the interference from the damaged aircraft's own systems. The channel was degrading exactly when they needed it most. "Shadow One, Emily's voice came through fragmented pieces of words through the interference. "Copy, say again, northeast." And then the channel cleared for exactly 1 second, one perfect second of signal clarity. And Walsh pressed the transmit key and said with everything she had, "Emily, northeast is a trap. They want you there. Find another way out." 1 second of clarity, then static. 12:39 a.m. Inside the cockpit of Shadow One, Emily Carter was climbing the northeast approach, and her fuel gauge was telling her things she did not want to know, and her hydraulic system was telling her things she had already accepted, and the canyon walls were falling away around her as she climbed toward the ridge, and Walsh's voice was breaking up in her headset into syllables and fragments that she was trying to reconstruct into meaning. "Northeast. Trap. Want you there." She had received enough of it. She had received enough of it to understand the shape of what Walsh was telling her, even if not every word had arrived intact. She looked at the ridge ahead of her. She looked at the fuel gauge. She looked at the hydraulic pressure reading. She thought about the canyon she had just spent 30 minutes learning at a level deeper than any briefing or map had ever taught her. There was another exit from Black Hollow. Not the northeast approach, which was the standard exit, the obvious exit, the exit that every piece of tactical analysis had identified as the correct exit. There was a secondary exit, a gap in the western ridge that the tactical maps marked as not viable for fixed-wing aircraft because of the approach angle in the clearance requirements. A gap that was on paper too narrow, too steep, too dangerous. Emily had not learned about this gap from a tactical map. She had learned about it 2 years ago, the first time she had flown this canyon, when she had been forced off her primary exit route and had looked at the terrain with the specific desperation of a person looking for any option that was not dying, and she had seen it. She had never told anyone about it. Because telling anyone about it would have required explaining why she knew it, and explaining why she knew it would have required reliving the mission in more detail than she had been prepared to do. She looked at the northeast ridge. She looked at where the prepared position would be, and she could see it now that she was looking for it, the shape of a placement designed to destroy an aircraft at the precise altitude and angle of a standard exit climb. She banked left, hard. Shadow 1 groaned around her. The hydraulic system protested the demand. The fuel alarm, which had been intermittent, went continuous, a steady, unwavering sound that meant she had minutes, not more. She pointed the aircraft at the western ridge, at the gap that no one else knew was there, at the exit that every piece of tactical analysis said was impossible. She had been told impossible things were impossible before. 12:40 a.m. In the command center, Shadow 1's transponder signal changed direction so abruptly that the display operator initially thought it was an instrument error. "She's turning," he said. She's going west. Shadow 1 is heading west." Walsh looked at the display, the secondary ridge. "There's no exit on the western ridge. The gap there isn't viable for her." "Apparently she thinks it is," Walsh said. She stood at the display and watched Shadow 1's signal move west, and she thought about the fuel state, and she thought about the hydraulic pressure, and she thought about a gap in the western ridge that every piece of analysis had classified as not viable, and she thought about Emily Carter, who had been classified as not viable 2 years ago, and had spent the intervening time maintaining an aircraft that was classified as not viable, preparing for a mission that was classified as not viable. She thought about what the word viable actually meant when Emily Carter was the one making the assessment. "Recovery teams," she said, "move them to the western ridge perimeter. All of them, now." 12:41 a.m. The western gap was narrower than Emily remembered. Everything was narrower than Emily remembered, partly because memory softens the most extreme elements of experience in self-defense, and partly because she was flying a damaged aircraft with compromised controls in a fuel state that was approaching the point where the engine would begin making decisions for her instead of the other way around. She committed to the approach at 12:41 and 30 seconds. Committing to the approach meant there was no turning back because the gap was at the end of a section of canyon that did not have room to reverse course. Commit or go into the wall. Those were the choices. She had made the first one, and now the second one was the thing she was preventing with every input she made to the controls. The aircraft wanted to drift right. The hydraulic inconsistency was biased right now, and she was correcting it with continuous left input that would have been tiring if she had any capacity for tiredness left, which she did not. She passed the first narrowing at 12:42. The canyon walls were close. She did not look at them. Looking at what you're trying to avoid is how you hit it. She looked at the gap ahead, and she flew toward it, and she made the corrections that needed to be made, and she did not look at the walls. The fuel alarm was a constant sound now, part of the cockpit environment, the way the engine sound was part of it, integrated into everything else she was processing. The second narrowing came at 12:42 and 45 seconds. This was the one the tactical analysis had flagged as the primary constraint, the point where the gap was at its minimum width, and the approach angle required a specific combination of speed and bank angle that the analysis had calculated as requiring more aircraft performance than the gap allowed. The analysis was correct. For a fully functional aircraft, Emily was not flying a fully functional aircraft. She was flying an aircraft with degraded hydraulics, critically low fuel battle damage to the airframe, and an altimeter that had been giving her slightly optimistic readings for the past 10 minutes. She was also flying it. She hit the second narrowing at exactly the speed and angle she needed, and the gap received her the way the cockpit seat received her, like a space that had been waiting, like a fit that required a specific shape to work, like something that looked impossible from the outside and felt from the inside like the only thing that made sense. Shadow 1 passed through the western gap at 12:43 a.m. The canyon was behind her. The ridge was behind her. The fuel alarm changed not to silence, but to a different sound, a sound. She knew the sound of an engine that was no longer receiving adequate fuel and was beginning the process of deciding what to do about that. She had cleared the canyon. She had not cleared the problem. 12:43 a.m. The command center heard it before they saw it. Emily's voice on the channel and the quality of it had changed again. Not the controlled tightness of the past 20 minutes, but something else, something that Walsh had to listen to for a full second before she identified it, because it was the last thing she had expected to hear. Relief. Not the big, overwhelming, I survived relief. The quiet kind. The kind that comes when you have done the thing you set out to do, and the doing of it is behind you, and what remains is just the practical matter of the aftermath. FOB Carson Shadow 1. I have cleared Black Hollow. Western exit. I'm declaring fuel emergency. Engine is going to flame out in approximately 90 seconds. I need a landing zone. Over. Walsh grabbed the transmit key. Shadow 1, copy your fuel emergency. Recovery teams are on the western perimeter. Can you maintain flight? 60 seconds maybe. What's my closest LZ? The display operator was already working. Flat ground western slope, 2 kilometers from the ridge exit. She'd need to glide it in. Walsh transmitted, Shadow 1, you have a landing zone 2 kilometers west of your current position. It's a glide approach from your current altitude. Do you have glide capacity? A pause. Then Emily, I'm going to find out. 12:44 a.m. The engine flamed out at 12:44 and 20 seconds. The sound of it was not dramatic. The engine did not stop with a bang or a grinding noise or any of the sounds that the movies associate with mechanical failure. It simply stopped. The constant, present, foundational sound of the aircraft under power became the different sound of an aircraft without power, which is quieter and has a different quality of air moving over the surfaces and which required a completely different relationship between the pilot and the machine. Shadow 1 was a glider now. Emily had glided an unpowered aircraft before. She had trained for it as all pilots train for it, and she had done it once in an actual emergency 8 years ago. A different aircraft, a different terrain, a different set of impossible numbers that had resolved into a survivable outcome. She was doing it again. The aircraft wanted to go down. Physics was insistent about this. She worked with physics instead of against it, managing the descent rate, managing the angle using the altitude she had to cover the distance she needed to cover. 2 kilometers. The landing zone the display operator had identified was flat enough and large enough for an unpowered landing. She knew this because she had trained on terrain assessment, and because she had Walsh's word for it, and because she did not have a better option, and so the landing zone was good by definition. She managed the glide. She talked to the aircraft the way she always talked to it, quietly. Not out loud, but in the specific way that pilots communicate with machines they know well, which is through their hands and their inputs and the relationship between what they ask and what the aircraft gives. Shadow 1 gave her everything it had left. 12:45 a.m. The recovery team lead, Master Sergeant Dora Kellerman. 15 years of search and rescue, a person who had recovered aircraft from situations that had not ended as well as this one, was standing on the western slope with her team when she saw Shadow 1 clear the ridge. No engine sound. The aircraft was silent, gliding, moving through the dark air above the slope with the specific quality of something that is committed entirely to a single trajectory and is executing it with no margin for deviation. Kellerman had her radio at her ear. Shadow 1, this is recovery lead. I have you visual. You are on correct approach. Landing zone is clear. Emily's voice, and it was steady, absolutely steady, the same voice it had been at the beginning. Copy recovery lead. Coming in. Kellerman watched the approach. She had her team positioned to move the moment the aircraft stopped moving, and she was watching the descent angle and the speed and the relationship between Shadow 1's altitude and the distance remaining to the landing zone, and what she was seeing was correct. Not comfortable, not safe in the way that safe usually meant, but correct in the way that competence under extreme constraint produces correctness, every variable managed to its limit, no margin to spare but enough. Shadow 1 touched down at 12:46 a.m. The landing was harder than anyone would have chosen, but the aircraft was intact when it stopped moving. The gear held. The airframe held. The cockpit remained closed and sealed until the aircraft came to a complete stop on the western slope of the mountain that contained Black Hollow, 2 years and a lifetime from the last time Emily Carter had landed there. Kellerman's team was moving before the aircraft fully stopped. The cockpit opened. Emily Carter climbed out. She stood on the wing for a moment, just one, and Kellerman, who was close enough to see her face, saw something that she would later try to describe to people and find inadequate language for. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something more private and more complex than either of those things. The face of a person who has finished something, and the finishing of it has revealed something about themselves that they had not entirely known before they started. Then Emily climbed down from the wing, and her feet hit the ground, and Kellerman was there. "Captain Carter," Kellerman said. Emily looked at her. "Status on Raven Squad. All 9 accounted for. Both critical casualties are en route to the surgical unit. The rest are aboard the rescue helicopters." Emily nodded once, the nod of someone receiving information they already intended to receive, confirmation rather than surprise. "Shadow 1 systems need immediate assessment," Emily said. "The hydraulic pressure log will show." "Captain," Kellerman put a hand on her arm, not holding her, just contact. "You can file the report in the morning." Emily looked at the hand on her arm. Then she looked at Shadow 1 sitting dark and silent on the slope behind her. The aircraft that had been classified as decommissioned and had just cleared the canyon that everyone had classified as impassable, and the machine that had carried her through the things she had spent 2 years believing she would never do again. "Yeah," Emily said, "in the morning." 12:47 a.m. The channel from Shadow 1 went active one more time that night, and it was not Emily who activated it. It was Walsh sitting at the console in the command center, watching the recovery team's position signal and Kellerman's confirmation come in, and she pressed the transmit key, not because there was anything operationally necessary to transmit, but because there are moments in a career where the professional framework becomes inadequate and something else is required instead. "Shadow 1," Walsh said, "all personnel are safe. Mission complete. Do you copy?" From Kellerman's radio relayed through the recovery team channel, Emily's voice came back for the last time that night. "Copy, FOB Carson." A pause, then, "Tell them I heard them. Tell them I was always going to answer." Walsh held the key for a moment after Emily's voice stopped. Then she set it down. Around her, the command center was moving again. The normal organized motion of a room returning to its operational rhythm, reports being filed, status being updated, the machinery of the military processing the night's events into the language of official record. Walsh stepped away from the console. She walked to the window. Outside, the darkness over the mountains was exactly the same darkness that had been there all night. The mountains were where they had always been. The canyon called Black Hollow was where it had always been. The stars were where they had been put. Everything looked the same as it had before. Everything was completely different. She thought about 9 men who were alive because someone had answered their call. She thought about an aircraft that had been classified as finished, and a pilot who had been classified as finished, and a canyon that had been classified as impossible, and the particular inadequacy of the word classified when the thing being classified was Emily Carter. She thought about General Holt standing in the doorway of the command center at 12:19, saying "copy that" to a woman he had grounded in a voice that contained something she recognized because she had heard it before in other voices, at other moments. The sound of a person understanding in real time that they had been wrong about something that mattered. She thought about Sergeant Reeves and Tommy Alvarez and the 8 other men who were going to wake up tomorrow in a world where they had survived something that the math said they shouldn't have survived, and she thought about what that does to a person, the surviving of the unsurvivable, and whether it changes the way they understand every day that comes after. She thought about Emily Carter standing on the western slope in the dark, her first question being about the status of the people she had gone in to protect. Not about herself, not about what came next, about them. Walsh stood at the window for a long time. Then she went back to her desk and began writing the report that would describe the night's events in the language that the official record required, and she wrote it carefully and accurately and completely, because accuracy was the least that the night deserved, and because the things that had happened in Black Hollow tonight were going to matter in ways that none of them could fully see yet, and the record needed to be right. She wrote for a long time. Outside the window, the darkness over the mountains began to change. Not yet dawn, not yet light, but the particular quality that the sky takes on in the hour before the sun, when the dark is still total, but the certainty of what's coming has already altered something in the air. The night was ending. The story was not. The sun came up over Phoebe Carson at 6:14 a.m., and by that time Emily Carter had been awake for 26 hours straight and had consumed approximately 4 cups of coffee that she did not remember drinking. She was sitting in the medical wing waiting area, not as a patient though. The flight surgeon had made 3 separate attempts to get her into an examination room and had been declined 3 times with the polite but absolute firmness of a person who has more important things to do than confirm that they are alive. She was sitting in the waiting area because the surgical unit was 40 feet down the corridor, and the 2 critical casualties from Raven Squad were in that surgical unit, and she was not leaving until she knew. She had not articulated this to anyone. She had simply sat down and stayed there, and the medical staff had apparently decided that arguing with her was not a productive use of their morning. At 6:22, the surgical unit door opened, and a doctor came out, young, tired, still in scrubs, with the specific expression of someone who has been working at the edge of their capacity for several hours and has arrived at a result they can live with. He saw Emily. He stopped. "You're Carter," he said. "How are they?" she said. He sat down across from her, not next to her, across from her, like someone who understands that the person they're talking to needs to be able to see their face clearly. "Both are going to make it," he said. "Specialist Okafor lost a lot of blood, but the damage was contained. Private Reeves, the other Reeves, the younger one, his leg is going to need additional surgery, probably 2 more procedures over the next month. But he's going to keep the leg. He's going to walk." Emily looked at the doctor for a moment. Then she looked at her hands. They were steady. They were always steady. But there was something in the way she looked at them, a private accounting, a check, the way you look at something after you have used it at the absolute limit of its capability to confirm that it is still what it was before. "Thank you," she said. "I should be saying that to you," the doctor said. She shook her head once. "You're the one who kept them alive." He opened his mouth to say something, then appeared to reconsider. He stood up. "Get some sleep, Captain. That's a medical recommendation, not a suggestion." He went back through the door. Emily sat for another minute. Then she stood up because sitting had become something her body was no longer cooperating with, and she walked out of the medical wing into the morning air, and the sun hit her face and she closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds of sun and silence, and the particular quality of a morning after a night that should not have ended the way it did. Then her radio crackled. "Captain Carter, this is Colonel Reed's office. The Colonel is requesting your presence in the command building at 0700. Please confirm." She looked at her watch, 6:31 a.m., 29 minutes. She keyed her radio. "Confirmed," she said. She already knew what 0700 meant. She had known since approximately 12:06 a.m. when she had lifted Shadow 1 off the runway without authorization. The morning after conversation was not a surprise. The military ran on accountability, and accountability ran on conversations like the one she was about to have, and Emily Carter had spent 2 years being the kind of person who understood that decisions have consequences, and who made her decisions anyway. Anyway, she went to get her 5th cup of coffee, 6:58 a.m. The corridor outside Colonel Reed's office had 3 people in it when Emily arrived, which was 2 more people than she had expected, and which told her immediately that the conversation she was about to have was not the straightforward accountability review she had been preparing for. One of the people was Walsh, which was not entirely surprising. Walsh had been involved in this from the beginning, and the official record would need her testimony. None of the people was a JAG officer, a judge advocate, General's Corps lawyer in full uniform with a briefcase with the carefully neutral expression of someone who is professionally obligated not to telegraph what kind of meeting this is going to be. The third person was General Marcus Holt. I was standing at the end of the corridor with his back to her, looking at nothing in particular, in the posture of a man who arrived early to things and used the early time to compose himself. He heard her footsteps and turned. They looked at each other across 12 feet of corridor. Emily had prepared in the 29 minutes since the summons a version of herself for this meeting, professional, factual, neither apologetic nor defiant. The version of herself that acknowledged what she had done and stood behind it without performance. She had prepared this, and she held it steady now, even as she looked at the face of the man who had ordered the radio turned off while 9 people begged for their lives. Holt held her gaze. "Captain Carter," he said. "General?" A pause. The JAG officer was looking at his briefcase. Walsh was looking at the wall. The corridor was very quiet. "Thank you for coming," Holt said. It was such a strange thing to say in the context of a summons that Emily did not respond to it immediately. She processed it for a second. Then she said, "I was asked to be here at 0700. "Yes." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded toward the office door. "Let's go in." 7:03 a.m. The office was Colonel Reed's, but Colonel Reed was not in it. Instead, behind the desk sat a person Emily had not expected, Brigadier General Susan Mercer. Inspector General's office, Washington. Emily recognized her from a briefing 3 years ago. Mercer was 54 years old, had the posture of a person who had spent decades in rooms like this one, delivering verdicts, and was looking at Emily with an expression that was completely unreadable. Emily sat down in the chair indicated. Walsh sat to her left. The JAG officer sat to her right and opened his briefcase. Holt took a chair against the wall, not at the table but back from it, a positioning that Emily registered and filed. Mercer looked at Emily for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Captain Carter, you are aware that last night you flew a military aircraft without authorization, violated a direct order from a general officer, entered a classified combat zone without clearance, and engaged enemy forces without operational sanction. Is that an accurate summary?" Emily held Mercer's gaze. "It is." "And you are aware that any one of those actions individually constitutes a court-martial offense under the Uniform Code of Military Justice?" "I am." Mercer nodded. She picked up a file from the desk and opened it. She studied something in it for a moment that felt considerably longer than it probably was. Then she looked up. 9 lives saved," she said. 2 rescue helicopters protected from a prepared enemy ambush. An enemy position that had been classified as impenetrable disrupted. A gap in the western ridge of Black Hollow confirmed as a viable emergency exit route, which means every future mission operating near that canyon now has an additional option that the tactical database did not previously contain. She closed the file. "Do you understand the operational significance of what you accomplished last night?" Emily said nothing. "Captain Carter, I asked you a question." "I understand the significance of what I did," Emily said. "I understood it before I did it." Mercer studied her. "Then explain to me why you did it." Emily looked at her steadily. "Because 9 people were going to die and I was the only person who could stop it." "You were not authorized to make that determination." "No," Emily agreed, "I wasn't." The authorized determination made by a general officer with full situational awareness was that the mission was not viable. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said very carefully, "The authorized determination was made by a general officer who turned off the radio so he wouldn't have to listen to them die. That's not situational awareness. That's situational avoidance." The room went very still. Mercer did not look away from Emily's face. Holt, from his chair against the wall, made no sound. The JAG officer stopped writing. Walsh, who had been looking at the table, looked up. Mercer said, "That is a significant accusation, Captain." "It's an accurate one," Emily said. "General Holt can confirm or deny it. The communications log will confirm or deny it. I'm not making an accusation. I'm answering your question about why I did what I did." She kept her voice level. She kept her hands still in her lap. "I went into that canyon because someone had to. I violated orders because the orders were wrong. And I would do it again in the same situation with the same information. I want that on the record." Silence. Real silence, the kind that fills a room when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and everyone in the room is deciding what to do with it. Then from the chair against the wall, General Holt spoke. "She's right," he said. Everyone looked at him. I was looking at his hands. His voice was the same level measured voice it had been all night, but something in it was different. Something that had not been there before, some quality that Walsh would later identify after thinking about it for a long time as the sound of a person who has finished fighting something internal and arrived at a resolution. "She's right," he said again. "I turned off the radio, I made the call, and the call was wrong." He looked up and found Mercer's eyes. "I will say that in any proceeding, formal or informal, that's on the record too." The JAG officer had started writing again. Mercer looked at Holt for a long moment. Then she looked back at Emily. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. 10. Then Mercer said, Step outside for a moment, Captain Carter. Emily stood in the corridor and thought about nothing in particular, which was unusual for her and which she suspected was the result of having run the internal processing systems at maximum capacity for approximately the past 8 hours. She had thoughts, but they were not organized thoughts. They were more like weather-present ambient, not yet resolved into anything that required action. Walsh came out of the office after 4 minutes. She closed the door behind her and stood next to Emily, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was the kind of silence that exists between people who have been through something together and do not need to fill the air with words to communicate. Then Walsh said, "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine." Walsh looked at her. "Emily." A pause. Emily looked at the corridor wall. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a week." Walsh nodded. That was the honest answer, and Walsh respected honest answers. "For what it's worth," she said, "Holt just told Mercer that the official recommendation from his office will be that no disciplinary action is warranted." Emily turned to look at her. "He said that." "He said that." Walsh paused. "He also said that the mission last night should be formally designated as authorized retroactive to the time of takeoff, which means your record shows an authorized flight, not an unauthorized one." Emily was quiet for a moment. "That's generous." "It's accurate," Walsh said. "He authorized it retroactively at 12:19 a.m. He said so on the channel. It's in the communications log." She looked at Emily. "He may have been wrong about the initial decision. He wasn't wrong after 12:19. Emily thought about this. She thought about Holt standing at the window at 12:06, watching Shadow One's navigation lights disappear into the mountains. She thought about him preparing the rescue helicopters. She thought about him saying "copy that" in the voice that had something broken in it. "People can be right about the wrong thing," Emily said. Walsh raised an eyebrow. "I was right to be cautious," Emily clarified. "Black Hollow is lethal. The risk assessment wasn't wrong. 4 aircraft went in there before me and didn't come back. He had legitimate reasons for the decision he made." She paused. "He was just wrong that it was the only decision available." Walsh looked at her for a long moment. "You're more generous than I would be." "I've had 2 years of quiet to think about what it costs to be in his position," Emily said. "That tends to produce generosity." The office door opened. Mercer appeared in the doorway. "Captain Carter, come back in, please." 7:24 a.m. What Brigadier General Mercer said when Emily was seated again took 4 minutes to say and could be summarized much more briefly, but Mercer was a person who understood that the way things were said was as important as what was said, and she took the 4 minutes. The summary was this: no disciplinary action. The mission was classified as authorized. Emily's flight status was reinstated effective immediately. Shadow 1 would be assessed for repair viability, and a formal review of the circumstances leading to General Holt's initial decision would be conducted by the Inspector General's office, which was Mercer's office, which meant Mercer herself would be conducting it. Emily listened to all of this without expression. When Mercer finished, Emily said, "In the review of General Holt's decision, what's the likely outcome?" Mercer looked at her. "That's not information I'm able to share at this stage." "I'm not asking for a prediction," Emily said. "I'm asking what the purpose of the review is. Is it punitive administrative? Or is it to change the protocol so that the next time a general officer is faced with a situation like last night's, the framework gives them a different option than turning off the radio?" A pause. Mercer said the latter. Emily nodded. "Then I'll cooperate fully." Mercer looked at her for a moment. Then she said something that was not in the official language of an IG review, something that fell outside the professional register of the meeting entirely. "For what it's worth, Captain Carter," she said, "I've been in this office for 11 years. I have reviewed a great many missions and a great many decisions. What you did last night, I won't say I've never seen it because that would diminish other people who have done courageous things in front of me." She paused. "But I will say it was extraordinary, and I want that on the record too." Emily looked at her. "Thank you," she said. 7:31 a.m. Sergeant Daniel Reeves was awake. I had been awake since 6:45 when the pain medication had worn off enough to let consciousness back in, and he had spent the intervening 46 minutes doing an inventory. This was what he did every morning, a personal accounting, each part checked against expectation. Today the inventory took longer than usual because the expectation had been as recently as Hunuru a.m. this morning that there would be no inventory, that the person conducting it would not be present to conduct it. I was present, all of him. He lay in the hospital bed and thought about this for a while. Tommy Alvarez appeared in the doorway of his room at 7:31, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body is doing fine, but whose nervous system has not entirely caught up with the fact that the danger is over. Tommy's arm was bandaged from the wrist to the elbow, shrapnel, not deep, the doctor had called it minor, and Tommy had nodded as though the word minor applied to any part of the past 12 hours. "You're up," Tommy said. "Yeah." Tommy came in and sat down in the chair next to the bed, and for a moment they sat in the particular silence of two people who have been through something together that they have not yet developed the language for. "How's the arm?" Reeves asked. "Doesn't hurt much," Tommy said. "Then that's probably still the medication." "Probably." Another silence. Then Tommy said, "Did you hear Shadow 1 made it out?" Reeves looked at him. "When did you hear that?" "Nurse told me. 20 minutes ago. She said the pilot landed on the Western Slope. Aircraft is damaged, but the pilot's okay." He paused. "She said the pilot came out of the cockpit and her first question was about us, about whether we were okay." Reeves said nothing. Tommy was quiet for a moment. "I want to meet her," he said. Is that something you can do? Just ask to meet someone who..." "Yeah," Reeves said. "That's something you can do." "How?" Reeves pushed himself up in the bed. His body complained about this, a full-body complaint registered through every system simultaneously. He managed it. "You ask," he said. "You walk up and you say thank you. That's how." Tommy looked at him. "What if she doesn't want..." "Tommy?" Reeves met his eyes. "She went into Black Hollow alone. She went into the canyon that killed 4 aircraft before her alone with a plane that barely worked, and she flew it into the fight to buy us time to get out. And when she came out the other side with no fuel left and a plane that was falling apart, her first question was about whether we were okay." He held Tommy's gaze. "She would want to meet you." Tommy absorbed this. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, okay." 9:15 a.m. Emily was in the maintenance hangar when they came to find her. She had gone there after the meeting with Mercer, partly because the hangar was the place she was most comfortable, and partly because Shadow 1 had been brought back to the base on a flatbed transport at 8:30, and she wanted to see the damage in daylight with her own eyes. What she saw, she had expected. The hydraulic system was worse than the instruments had indicated, which meant the instruments had been optimistic, which meant the margins she had been working inside were even thinner than she had calculated. The airframe had taken more structural stress than a formal inspection would have called acceptable. Several systems that she had classified as functional had degraded past the line during the mission and were now definitively non-functional. Shadow 1 was not flying again anytime soon. She stood next to the aircraft and looked at it, and she felt the specific quality of the moment with the specific part of herself that had always understood aircraft not as machines, but as something more complicated than machines. Shadow 1 had done everything she had asked. It had done things that the spec sheet said it could not do. It had taken everything the canyon had offered and answered every demand she had put on it, and at the end had glided down a dark slope to a landing that objectively should not have been survivable. "You did good," she said to it. She was aware that she was talking to a machine. She did it anyway. She heard footsteps behind her. Multiple sets hesitant, the footsteps of people who are not sure they are welcome in the space they're entering. She turned. 9 men. The 2 critical casualties were still in the surgical unit. She knew one of them, not yet out of post-operative monitoring. So 7 men and Sergeant Reeves, who was moving with the careful posture of someone who has been told by medical staff to take it easy and has interpreted this as an advisory rather than an instruction. They stopped when she turned. Reeves met her eyes from across the hangar. He was not what she had imagined, which was a thing she realized only when she saw him, that she had been imagining something. Some version of the man whose voice she had heard on the radio, and that the version in front of her was both more ordinary and more significant than the imagining. He was a medium-sized man with a tired face and eyes that had the look of someone who has recently been on the far side of something and has come back from it changed. He walked toward her with the careful deliberateness of someone navigating both a physical injury and something that was not physical at all. He stopped 3 feet away. "Captain Carter," he said. "Sergeant Reeves," she said. A pause. Tommy Alvarez, standing behind Reeves with the bandaged arm and the face of a 19-year-old who has recently aged approximately a decade, said, "We wanted to," and then stopped because what they wanted to was something that did not fit cleanly into a sentence. Emily looked at them. All of them. One by one, which took a moment because there were 8 of them and she was doing it properly. She looked at each face. You held position, she said, all night, with 2 critical casualties and almost no ammunition. You held. She paused. I came to do a job. You made it possible to do it. Reeves shook his head. We were done, he said. We had 8 minutes of ammunition left, maybe. We had no exit. He stopped. Started again. We were done and then you came. I heard you, she said. I know. His voice was different from the radio voice, but it had the same quality, the levelness, the control, but with something underneath it that the radio had compressed and that the room made visible. I know you heard us. I needed to say it to your face, that we know what you did. We know what it cost, and He stopped again. There was something in his face that he was managing, and Emily recognized the managing of it because it was the same thing she had been managing in her own chest since approximately 12:43 a.m. Thank you, he said. 2 words. Tommy said it too, almost simultaneously, his voice cracking slightly on the second word in a way that he was clearly not pleased about, and that none of the other men appeared to notice, or at least to acknowledge noticing. Then each of the other 6 men said it. Not in unison, not choreographed, just one after another in the particular way that people say true things, not loudly, not with performance, but with the specific weight of words that mean exactly what they say. Emily stood in the hangar with Shadow One behind her and listened to 8 men thank her, and she felt the words land in the place that words like that land, which is not the ears but somewhere deeper, the place where the things that matter most are stored. And she did not say you're welcome because your welcome was inadequate. She said, go home to your families. Reeves looked at her. Something moved in his face. What about you? She looked at Shadow One, then back at Reeves. I am home, she said. 11:30 a.m. The twist that changed everything arrived not in a meeting room or a hangar or a command center, but in an intelligence report that landed on Walsh's desk at 11:30 a.m. and that Walsh read 3 times before she fully processed its implications. The report had been compiled by the same intelligence team that had broken the enemy command net frequency at 12:38 the previous night. It was a full analysis of the communications they had intercepted, and it contained something that had not been visible in the heat of the previous night's events. Something that in daylight with time to think was significantly larger than anyone had understood. Walsh read it a 4th time. Then she picked up her phone. I need to see General Holt, she said. Now it's not optional. She was in his office at 11:41. She put the report on his desk without preamble and said, the enemy forces in Black Hollow last night were not there by accident. They weren't there for Raven Squad specifically. She pointed to the relevant section. The intercepts show they had intelligence about Shadow One, about Emily specifically. They knew about her history with the canyon. They set the northeast trap specifically for her. Holt read the section she was pointing at. He read it twice. Then he looked up. They knew she would come. They knew that if any aircraft was going to attempt Black Hollow after Raven Squad's transmission, it would be her, Walsh said. They had intelligence on her flying record, on her knowledge of the canyon, on the fact that Shadow One was maintained and ready. She paused. The ambush wasn't for Raven Squad. It was for Emily Carter. Holt was very still. Which means, Walsh continued, that someone gave them that information. Someone who knew about Emily's history with Black Hollow and Shadow One's maintenance status and the likelihood that she would respond if Raven Squad called. The office was very quiet. Holt set the report down. His voice when he spoke was very careful. How far up does this investigation need to go? Walsh met his eyes. As far as it goes, she said. Sir. Holt looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone. Get me the Inspector General's office, he said. Brigadier General Mercer, priority. He looked at Walsh while he waited for the call to connect. Emily needs to know, he said. Yes. Walsh agreed. She does. 12:02 p.m. Emily was still in the hangar when Walsh found her again, which surprised Walsh for approximately 1 second before it did not surprise her at all. She had been working. Not on Shadow One. Shadow One required a level of repair that went beyond what one person could do in one morning, but on the documentation. She had been sitting on the hangar floor with the aircraft's maintenance logs spread around her, compiling a full accounting of every system and its status before, during, and after the mission. It was thorough, and it was unnecessary in the immediate term, and it was exactly the kind of thing Emily Carter would be doing the morning after flying into Black Hollow alone, because thoroughness was how she processed things that were too large to process any other way. She looked up when she heard Walsh's footsteps. She read Walsh's face in the time it took Walsh to cross the hangar. "What happened?" Emily said, not a question. Walsh sat down on the hangar floor. She sat cross-legged, which was not a thing she would normally do in her uniform, and the fact that she did it now said something about where the conversation was going that the words hadn't said yet. She told Emily about the intelligence report. She told it straight. No cushioning, no preparation, no careful framing. Emily was not a person who benefited from careful framing. She was a person who needed the accurate information delivered at the speed at which the information existed. Emily listened. She listened without expression. Her hands were still on the maintenance log in her lap. Her eyes were on Walsh's face. When Walsh finished, Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They knew I would come." "Yes. They used Raven Squad as bait. For me. That's what the intercepts suggest." Emily looked at the floor. She looked at the maintenance logs in her lap. She looked at the undercarriage of Shadow One visible from where she was sitting, the aircraft that someone had apparently been tracking for long enough to build an ambush around its pilot's response pattern. "How long have they had intelligence on me?" she said. "We don't know yet," Walsh said. "Mercer's office is opening a formal investigation. The scope of the intelligence breach is unknown at this point." She paused. "Emily, the person who provided them with information about you, it's someone with access to classified records. Someone inside the system." The implication sat between them. Emily looked up. Her face was still controlled, still level, but there was something moving underneath the control that Walsh could see because she had spent the past 8 hours learning to read the gap between Emily's surface and whatever was operating beneath it. "Not Holt," Emily said. "We don't know." "Not Holt," Emily said again with more certainty. "He turned off the radio because he was afraid of losing more aircraft. That's a mistake. That's a bad mistake. But someone who set me up wouldn't prepare the helicopters the moment I launched. He prepared them because he changed his mind. A person who set me up wouldn't change their mind." Walsh considered this. It was logic she had not fully run through herself, and she ran through it now and found it sound. "You're probably right," she said, "but the investigation will determine—" "I know," Emily said. "I'll cooperate. I said I would." She paused. "Walsh?" "Yeah." "The 9 men are safe?" "Yes." "Whatever else is true, whatever this investigation finds, whoever set this up, whatever it means for what happened last night, the 9 men are safe." She looked at Walsh directly. "That's what matters. That's what I went in there for, and it's done." Walsh looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "it is done." They sat on the hangar floor in silence for a while, the way people sit after the adrenaline leaves, and what remains is just the fact of what has been survived. Outside, the base was moving with its normal rhythm, vehicles' voices, the mechanical sounds of a working installation. Inside, Shadow One sat dark and still, and the maintenance logs were spread on the floor, and 2 women were sitting cross-legged on the concrete talking about things that mattered. At some point, Walsh said, "What are you going to do now?" Emily considered the question. It was a bigger question than it appeared, and they both knew it. It contained within it the question of flight status restored and Shadow One rebuilt or replaced, and what Emily Carter did with the chapter of her life that came after the chapter that had just ended. "Fix the aircraft," she said. "Fly." Walsh almost smiled. "Just like that." "It's what I do," Emily said. She looked at Shadow One. "It's what I've always done." 2:45 p.m. The last piece arrived at 2:45 in the afternoon, and it arrived in the form of a phone call to Walsh's office from a number in Washington that Walsh did not recognize, and that when she answered, connected her to a voice she did not recognize, either a calm, precise voice that identified itself as belonging to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. The voice said that the Secretary had been briefed on the events at Black Hollow. The voice said that a formal review was being initiated at the highest levels. The voice said that certain elements of the mission record would be classified at a level above Walsh's current clearance for reasons related to the ongoing intelligence breach investigation. And then the voice said something that Walsh had not expected and that she wrote down immediately after the call ended, word for word, because she did not want to lose any part of it. The voice said that Shadow One's mission record would be formally preserved. Not classified, not buried, not processed into the language of reports that reduced what had happened to coordinates and casualty figures in fuel states. Preserved in its entirety. The Secretariat, the voice said, believes that certain things should be remembered accurately. Walsh wrote it down. She sat at her desk and looked at what she had written and thought about what it meant, not for the official record, which would say what it said and be read by the people who read such things, but for the real record, which exists in different places and is read differently. She thought about Sergeant Reeves saying Emily's name in the hospital room. She thought about Tommy Alvarez's voice cracking on the second word of thank you. She thought about 8 men standing in a hangar and looking at a woman who had gone into the dark for them. She thought about the things that get remembered and the things that get forgotten and what determines which is which. Then she picked up her phone and called Emily. Emily answered on the second ring. Walsh? Yeah, I have something to tell you. A pause. Is it bad? No, Walsh said. Actually, no. It's something else, she told her. Emily was quiet on the other end of the line for a moment. Then she said very quietly something that Walsh had not expected from a person who had spent 2 years being a ghost and had spent the previous night proving that ghosts could still fly. That's enough. That's more than enough. Walsh held the phone and said nothing because nothing was the right response. Walsh, Emily said, yeah, get some sleep. Walsh almost laughed. You too. The call ended. Outside Walsh's window, the afternoon had gone gold and long, the specific quality of light that late afternoon produces in this part of the world, warm and directional, making shadows precise, and everything they fall across seemed more real than it was a few hours ago. Shadow 1 sat in the hangar. Emily Carter's name was in a file in Washington marked preserved. 9 men were alive, and somewhere in the machinery of the military, a rot that had fed an enemy ambush with the profile of a ghost pilot was about to be found and cut out because Brigadier General Mercer had opened an investigation, and Mercer did not open investigations she did not intend to finish. The story was not over, but the night was, and the night had ended the only way that mattered, with everyone who deserved to be alive still breathing. The investigation that Brigadier General Mercer opened on the morning after Black Hollow moved faster than anyone expected, and it moved in a direction that nobody had been prepared for. Within 48 hours of Walsh's 11:41 meeting with Holt, the intelligence breach inquiry had expanded from a single classified file access to a pattern of unauthorized data transfers spanning 14 months. Within 72 hours, it had a name attached to it. And within 96 hours, 4 days after Emily Carter had climbed out of Shadow 1's cockpit on the western slope and asked about the status of 9 men she had never met, the name attached to the breach was sitting in a room very similar to the one Emily had sat in, answering questions that did not have good answers. The name was Major Conrad Hess, logistics officer, 8 years of clean service, access to classified personnel records, mission histories, and aircraft maintenance logs access. That was routine for his position, and that he had used for 14 months to build a profile on Emily Carter that he had transferred in pieces to a contact whose name the investigation was still working to confirm. Walsh received the briefing from Mercer's office on day 4, and she sat in her chair and read the summary twice, and then put it flat on her desk and looked at the ceiling for approximately 30 seconds. Then she called Emily. We have a name, she said. Emily was quiet for a moment. Who? Hess, Major Conrad Hess. Do you know him? Silence. Walsh counted 4 seconds. I know who he is, Emily said. Her voice had the careful quality of someone measuring what they say against what they know. He processed the paperwork when I was removed from flight status 2 years ago. He was the logistics officer who signed off on Shadow 1's reclassification. Walsh felt something cold move through her. He had access to your full file. He built my full file, Emily said. He was the one who compiled the assessment that got me grounded. Another pause. Walsh, how long has he been doing this? 14 months minimum. So he was feeding them information about me the entire time I was in the maintenance hangar. Everything I was doing to keep Shadow 1 operational. Everything about my maintenance schedule, my access patterns. Emily's voice had gone very flat and very precise. They knew Shadow 1 was ready because he told them it was ready. They knew I would respond to Black Hollow because he told them I would respond. Yes, Walsh said. He built the ambush, Emily said. He didn't pull a trigger. But he built the ambush. Yes. The silence on the line lasted long enough that Walsh checked her phone to confirm the call was still connected. Then Emily said, Are the 9 men safe because of it? Walsh frowned. What do you mean? I mean, if Hess hadn't built the ambush, if they hadn't set that trap specifically for me, would Raven Squad have been in Black Hollow at all? Was their mission compromised too? Was the whole thing designed to get me in that canyon? Her voice was controlled, but underneath the control, Walsh could hear something moving, the specific quality of a person who is re-examining something they thought they understood and finding a different shape underneath. If they used Raven Squad to draw me in, then Raven Squad was in danger because of me. Those 9 men were almost killed because someone wanted to use them as bait for me. Walsh opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. We don't have confirmation of that yet, she said carefully. The investigation is still Walsh. Emily, is that what the investigation is finding? A pause. It's one of the scenarios being examined, Walsh said. Yes. The line went quiet again. When Emily spoke, her voice was different, not broken. Emily Carter's voice did not break the way other people's voices broke. But there was something in it that Walsh had not heard before, something that was past control and past the careful professional management of feeling that Emily deployed so consistently that it had come to seem like her natural state. It was grief, not for herself, not for the 2 years in the maintenance hangar, or the career interrupted, or the night in the canyon, or any of it. Grief for 9 men who had been placed in a lethal situation as a consequence of someone else's plan to destroy their rescuer. They were almost killed because of me, Emily said. They were saved because of you, Walsh said. Hold on to that. Whatever else is true, whatever the investigation finds about why Raven Squad was in that canyon, they came out of it because you went in. That's real. That happened. A long silence, then quietly, yeah, Walsh said. Day 5, 9:00 a.m. Major Conrad Hess was escorted out of Phoebe Carson at 0900 on day 5 in the company of 2 MPs and a JAG officer. And the official record of that departure was classified at a level that most people on the base would never have access to. But bases are communities, and communities talk, and by 10:00 a.m., the general shape of what had happened was moving through Phoebe Carson. The way information moves through closed communities in fragments, in whispers assembled differently by different people, but consistently pointing in the same direction. A man had sold Emily Carter to her enemies. A man who had sat at a desk on this base and processed paperwork and attended briefings and eaten in the same mess hall as everyone else, had spent 14 months building a file on a grounded pilot and her maintained but decommissioned aircraft. And he had traded that file for something that the investigation had not yet publicly identified, but that everyone assumed was money. Because money was the most common reason people did things like this, and the simplest explanations were usually the accurate ones. Specialist Chen, who had been awake for 22 hours the night of Black Hollow, and who had said, "Oh God," very quietly, when Shadow 1 dropped 40 meters in 6 seconds, heard the news at 10:15 a.m., and sat very still at her station for a full minute before she trusted herself to go back to work. She thought about the open channel. She thought about Emily's voice, steady, steady, always steady, moving through the canyon while someone who ate in the same mess hall had been sending her coordinates to the people trying to kill her. She thought about the gap between what a person presents to the world and what they are actually doing inside that presentation. And she thought about how you can work alongside someone for months and not see it. And she thought about whether there was anything she should have seen and hadn't. She did not find an answer to that. She suspected no one would. At 10:30, she got up from her station and walked to the communications room and found Walsh, who was on her 3rd cup of coffee and her 4th hour of the day. And Chen said, "Ma'am, I needed to tell someone that night. When Shadow 1 dropped altitude at 12:33, I said, 'Oh God,' out loud. That was unprofessional." Walsh looked at her. "That was human," Walsh said. "There's a difference." Chin nodded. She started to leave. Then she turned back. "Is Captain Carter okay?" Walsh considered the question and what it actually contained, which was more than the 4 words it was built from. "She will be," Walsh said. "Give her time." Day 7, 2:15 p.m. Emily had not left the base in 7 days, which was not unusual. She had spent 2 years barely leaving the base, but the quality of her presence on it had changed in a way that several people noticed, and none of them could precisely articulate. She was in the maintenance hangar. She was always in the maintenance hangar. But the work she was doing had changed. Shadow 1's repair was underway, officially authorized now. with a full maintenance crew assigned the kind of resources that a decommissioned aircraft had not merited for 2 years, and that a formerly reinstated pilot's aircraft absolutely did. Emily was working alongside the maintenance crew, and the crew, which had initially approached this with the polite efficiency of professionals working next to a senior officer, had within 2 days reorganized itself around her, the way people reorganize around a person who clearly knows more about the specific task than anyone else in the room. She was explaining the Western Gap to two of the crew chiefs when Reeves walked in. Not the injured Reeves, the other one, Daniel the sergeant, moving with the careful deliberateness of a person whose body has been through something and is being treated accordingly, but who has decided that the careful deliberateness will not prevent him from going where he needs to go. Emily saw him and straightened. She said something to the crew chiefs, who moved away with the tact of people who understand when they are being given a moment. Reeves crossed the hangar. "You should be in medical," Emily said. "I've been in medical for 6 days," Reeves said. "I needed air." She looked at him. "How's the shoulder?" "They say it's going to be fine." He stopped a few feet from her. He had the look he'd had in the hangar on day one, the same assessment, the same careful attention to her face that she was giving his. "I heard about Hess," he said. Emily nodded. "Is it true what people are saying, that Raven Squad was in that canyon because of you? Because they were using us to—" "The investigation isn't complete," Emily said. "Emily," he used her first name. It was the first time he had, and she registered it. "Is it true?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "That's the direction it's going." Reeves processed this. She watched him do it, watched the calculation move through his face, the re-examination of the sequence of events through this new lens, the arrival at a conclusion that he then sat with for a moment before he spoke. "Then we owe you twice," he said. She shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. We were in that canyon because someone was trying to kill you," he said. "And you came in anyway, knowing it was a trap. Walsh warned you at 12:38, and you turned the aircraft around and found another way out, and you stayed in that canyon until every one of us was out." He held her gaze. "You came in for us when we were the bait for a trap set for you." Emily looked at Shadow 1, at the aircraft that was slowly being put back together around them, panel by panel, system by system, all the damage of the night being assessed and repaired and replaced. "I heard your voice on the radio," she said. "That's all. I heard your voice and I knew what it meant, and I went." She paused. "The trap was real, the risk was real, but the voice was real too, and the voice was what I answered." Reeves was quiet for a moment. "My son is 12 years old," he said. It came out of nowhere, or seemed to. Emily understood immediately that it had not come from nowhere, that it had been building since he walked in, since probably before he walked in. He's going to grow up knowing his father came home. He's going to grow up because you heard my voice on a radio and you went. He stopped. His voice was level. He was a man who had trained himself to keep his voice level, much the way she had, and she recognized the training because she knew what it cost. "I don't know how to thank you for that. I don't think there's a way to thank you for that. But I needed you to know that I know what it means." Emily looked at him. She thought about a lot of things in that moment: the maintenance hangar, 2 years Shadow, one sitting in the dark, the radio transmission, the canyon, the fuel gauge, the Western Gap, the conversation about lives saved, and the conversation about breaches and betrayals, and the slow dismantling of the trap that had been set for her. She thought about a 12-year-old boy who was going to have a father at his next birthday. "Go home to him," she said. "Soon as they clear you medically, go home." Reeves nodded. He put his hand out. She took it. They shook hands the way soldiers shake hands, firm, brief, with the specific gravity of people who have exchanged something that cannot be put in words and are using the handshake to mark the exchange anyway. He walked back out of the hangar. Emily turned back to Shadow 1. The crew chief nearest to her, a young woman named Petty Officer Santos, who had been close enough to hear the exchange and who had the expression of someone who has just witnessed something she is going to carry for a long time, said quietly, "Captain Carter, can I ask you something?" "Yeah," Emily said. "Were you scared going in?" Emily picked up the component she had set down and looked at it for a moment. "Yes," she said. Santos blinked. "But you went anyway." "Being scared is information," Emily said. "It's not instructions." She went back to the work. "You learn that, eventually. Day 14, 11:00 a.m. The first formal hearing of Mercer's investigation took place on day 14 in a room with a long table and a stenographer, and a level of official gravity that the military applies to proceedings that it intends to take seriously and wants the record to reflect that it is taking seriously. Emily testified for 3 hours. She was precise. She was comprehensive. She answered every question with the same quality she brought to everything: complete, unperformed, without editing toward a particular outcome. She described what she knew, what she had observed, what she had inferred and why, and what she had done, and the reasoning behind each decision. At the end of 3 hours, Mercer looked at her across the table and said, "One final question, Captain Carter, and this is not for the record. The stenographer can stop." The stenographer stopped. "When you were in the canyon," Mercer said at 12:38, "when you received the broken transmission from Commander Walsh, warning you that the northeast approach was a trap, and you made the decision to turn toward the western gap, were you aware that the fuel state at that point made the western exit a potentially unsurvivable option?" Emily looked at her. "Yes," she said. "And you went anyway?" "Yes." "Why?" Emily thought about the question. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because the answer was something she had not said aloud before, and saying a thing aloud for the first time is different from knowing it. Because, she said, the northeast was certain death. The western gap was possible survival. Possible is always worth attempting. She paused. And because 9 men were on the helicopters that the northeast position was waiting for. My survival wasn't the only variable I was managing. Mercer held her gaze for a long moment. "Thank you, Captain," she said. The stenographer's hands went back to the keys. Day 21. The formal findings of Mercer's investigation were delivered on day 21 in a document that ran to 47 pages, classified, at a level that meant the public would never read most of it, and that contained within it a section titled Recommendations. That was the part Walsh read 4 times. She called Emily after the 4th reading. "Have you seen the recommendations?" Walsh said. "Mercer sent them to me this morning," Emily said. "The Rescue Aviation Program. I read it." "They want you to run it," Walsh said. A pause. "They want me to design it," Emily said, "and then run it. There's a difference. Is that a meaningful difference to you right now?" Another pause. Longer. "They want to name the aircraft Shadow 1, Emily said. "The primary aircraft for the program. They want to keep the name." Walsh smiled. She was at her desk and outside her window. The afternoon was doing something golden and long, similar to the afternoon 2 weeks ago, but lighter in quality, lighter in the specific way that things are lighter after something heavy has been resolved. "I think that's right," she said. "Me too," Emily said. "Emily, are you going to do it?" The silence lasted long enough this time that Walsh thought about saying her name again. Then Emily's voice came back, and it had something in it that Walsh had not heard from her before. Not the steadiness, which was always there, but something alongside the steadiness. Something warmer, something that sounded carefully and quietly, like the beginning of a future tense. "Yeah," Emily said, "I'm going to do it." Day 30, 8:00 a.m. The thing that nobody had planned for that arrived without announcement and without official sanction happened on the morning of day 30. Sergeant Daniel Reeves had been medically cleared for travel on day 28 and had spent day 29 on a transport home to his family, and on day 30 he was sitting at a kitchen table in Denton, Texas, drinking coffee while his 12-year-old son Marcus got ready for school, and Marcus came into the kitchen with his backpack over one shoulder and said, "Dad, I want to know what happened." Reeves looked at his son. Marcus was 12 and had his mother's eyes and Reeves' jaw, and the particular quality of attention that some children have, a real listening quality, the kind that makes adults instinctively give more honest answers than they had planned. "What do you mean?" Reeves said. "I mean what happened," Marcus said. "In the canyon. You told me you were on a mission and you came home safe, but I've seen your face since you got back. Something happened." Reeves wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. "I thought about how much truth a 12-year-old needed and how much truth a 12-year-old deserved, and he thought about the difference between those two quantities, and he decided after a moment that Marcus deserved the real version, not the classified version, not the specific coordinates and mission parameters and intelligence breach details that he would never repeat, but the real version, the version that was true in the way that stories are true when they carry something that matters. "We were in trouble," Reeves said. "Really serious trouble, and we called for help, and they said nobody could come, and then someone came anyway." Marcus sat down across from him. "Who?" "A pilot," Reeves said. "A woman named Emily Carter. She'd been told she couldn't fly anymore. The military had taken away her clearance. But when she heard us on the radio, she got in her aircraft and she came. They said she couldn't go and she went anyway. Yeah, because you called? Because we called, Reeves said, and she heard us. Marcus thought about this for a moment. Is she okay? She's okay, Reeves said. She landed on the side of the mountain with no fuel left. But she's okay. Did she get in trouble for going when they said she couldn't? Reeves thought about the answer to this. They tried to figure out whether to get her in trouble, he said. And then they figured out instead that she'd done something that they needed to make room for what she'd done. So instead of getting her in trouble, they asked her to build something, a program, to make sure there's always an aircraft ready to go when someone calls. Marcus absorbed this for a moment. So she broke the rules, he said, and instead of punishing her, they made her in charge of making new rules. Reeves looked at his son. Yeah, he said, pretty much. Marcus nodded slowly with the particular nod of someone filing information in the right place. Then he picked up his backpack. I have to go to school. I know. He was at the kitchen door. Then he stopped and turned. Dad? Yeah. I'm glad she heard you. Reeves looked at his son for a moment. At the 12-year-old who was going to grow up with a father because a pilot had answered a radio call that no one else would answer. Me too, he said. Me too, buddy. The door closed. Reeves sat at his kitchen table in Denton, Texas with his coffee and the morning light coming through the window and the sound of his house around him. And he thought about the canyon and he thought about Shadow One circling above them until the last person was out. And he thought about Emily Carter asking her first question and her first question being about his men. I thought about what it means to be the kind of person who hears a desperate voice and moves toward it instead of away from it. He thought about it for a long time, 6 weeks later. The thing the military does with stories it cannot fully contain is put them in programs, and the thing it does with people it cannot fully categorize is give them authority. And the thing it does with aircraft that have done something the spec sheet says they could not do is rebuild them and give them a new designation and hope that the name carries what the machine carried. Shadow One was rebuilt in 6 weeks, not repaired, rebuilt. New hydraulic system, new fuel management system, upgraded avionics airframe reinforced at the stress points that the Black Hollow mission had revealed, which were different from the stress points the engineers had anticipated and which told a story in the language of metal and load distribution about exactly what the aircraft had been through and how close the margins had actually been. When it was done, it did not look different from the outside, but everything inside it was new. Emily walked around it on the morning of the inspection with the maintenance crew lead and Santos and 2 engineers from the upgrade team, and she touched the airframe at specific points, not inspecting them. Santos realized, but greeting them. Reacquainting herself with a machine that was the same machine in name and history and was an entirely new machine in substance. She's ready, the crew lead said. Emily ran her hand along the fuselage. Yeah, she said, she is. New designation is in the system, the crew lead said. Ghost Guardian per the program paperwork. Ready to go official whenever you sign off. Emily stopped. She looked at the aircraft. She thought about the name. Ghost Guardian. It was a good name. It said something accurate about what the aircraft was for and what it was prepared to do. It was the kind of name that attached to a program and a mission would mean something to the pilots who flew it and the people it flew toward. She thought about Shadow One. She thought about 2 years in the dark. She thought about the voice on the radio and the decision she had made and what had happened next. Sign off on the program designation, she said. Ghost Guardian for the program. She paused. But this aircraft keeps her name. The crew lead looked at her. Ma'am, this specific aircraft, Emily said. This one, she's still Shadow One. She met the crew lead's eyes. Some names you earn, you don't retire them. The crew lead nodded slowly. Santos, standing behind them, wrote it in her notes. Shadow One retained 8 weeks later. The call came in at 3:22 in the morning. A rescue call from a different mountain range, a different unit, a different set of circumstances that were in their specifics entirely unlike Black Hollow, and in their essence exactly the same people in a place where they should not have been in a situation that had gone beyond what they had prepared for, calling into the dark on the chance that someone was listening. Emily was in the ready room when the call came in. The Ghost Guardian program had been operational for 2 weeks. It had 12 pilots, 6 aircraft, AA communications protocol that Walsh had helped design in a chain of command that had been structured specifically to prevent the sequence of events that had led to General Holt turning off a radio while 9 people begged for their lives. The chain of command for this call went through Emily. She listened to the transmission. She looked at the tactical display. She looked at the weather report in the enemy positioning data, in the fuel calculations, in the rescue window, and she ran through everything the way she had always run through everything, fast complete, with the specific fluency of a person who has done this long enough that the analysis has become a kind of instinct. Then she looked at the pilot sitting across from her, a young woman named Lieutenant Daniels, 27 years old, 18 months of combat flight experience, who had joined the Ghost Guardian program because she had heard the story of Black Hollow and had wanted with the specific clarity of a person who knows what they are made for to be part of what came after it. "Your call," Emily said. Daniels looked at the display. "Is the window viable? What do you think?" "I think it's tight," Daniels said. "I think the weather is a problem on the east approach, but the west is cleaner than the report suggests. I think we have a viable window if we move in the next 8 minutes." She paused. "I think we go." Emily looked at her. "Then go," she said. Daniels was already moving. Emily watched her go. Watched the young pilot cross the ready room with the specific quality of movement that pilots have when the decision has been made, and what remains is execution, that quality of focused forward motion that has no backward in it. She thought about a night 8 weeks ago in a corridor at a Phoebe Carson, and a mechanic's voice saying 2 words that had reordered everything. She thought about the voice on the radio. She thought about what it means to build something that answers when someone calls so that the answer is there before the need for it, so that the pilot who needs to go in does not also have to be the pilot who fights through a command structure to get airborne, so that the gap between a voice in the dark and an engine in the sky is as small as human preparation and human will can make it. She thought about all of this, and then she went to the communications console and opened the channel and listened. Daniel's voice came through, clean and certain. "Ghost Guardian 1 launching. We have the call. We're going in." Emily pressed the transmit key. "Ghost Guardian 1, this is Shadow 1 Actual. You are clear. Bring them home." "Copy, Shadow 1 Actual. We'll bring them home." The engine sound in the background of the channel swelled and then diminished as the aircraft moved away from the microphone range and into the night, and Emily stood at the console and listened to it go. And she thought about 8 weeks ago when she had been the one going, and she thought about what it meant that now there was someone else going. Someone she had trained and prepared and trusted, which meant the thing she had done on that night was no longer a single event, but a beginning. A beginning of something that would outlast her, and outlast Shadow 1, and outlast any individual mission or any individual act of courage. A thing that answered, always answered, because the call in the dark was real, and the answer to the call was the most important thing a person could give. 4 months later, in a briefing room in Washington, that Emily would never see a senior military official summarize the Ghost Guardian program's first operational quarter in language, that the official record required missions, executed, lives saved, windows utilized, personnel recovered. The numbers were good. The numbers were better than the program's design projections, which were themselves more optimistic than anything the previous rescue protocol had produced. At the end of the summary, the official said, "The program works because it was designed by someone who understood what it costs to hear a voice in the dark and not answer it. Captain Carter built something that answers. Every time. Whatever it costs." Nobody in the room responded to this immediately, because it was the kind of statement that sits in a room after it's made and does not need anything added to it. And in a hangar on Phoebe Carson's Shadow, 1 sat in the ready state that Emily had established as the program standard, fueled, certified, maintained to the last system, ready to launch in under 4 minutes from any call, not decommission, not waiting, not a ghost, ready. Because Emily Carter had spent 2 years in the dark, maintaining an aircraft that no one believed would fly again, and she had done it because she understood something that the official record had never quite captured, and that the numbers in the Washington briefing room could gesture toward but not contain. She understood that the voice in the dark does not stop needing an answer just because the answer is hard. She understood that the call does not stop being real just because the risk is real. And she understood in the specific way that only the people who have heard those voices and chosen to answer them truly understand that there are moments in a life when who you are is not determined by what you are authorized to do, but by what you are willing to do when authorization runs out, and the radio is still open, and a human voice is still asking, still fighting, still refusing to accept that silence is the answer. Emily Carter had never accepted that silence was the answer. She never would, and as long as Ghost Guardian flew, neither would anyone who came after her. That was the story of the ghost pilot who answered the last call. That was the story of Shadow One. And it was not a story about rules broken or orders defied or the machinery of authority and its limits. It was a story about a voice in the dark and a pilot who heard it and moved.